On New Year's Day 2023, while the world celebrated fresh beginnings, a man in the affluent town of Cohasset, Massachusetts, was designing a gruesome end. At 4:48 a.m., Brian Walsh didn't reach for a glass of water. He reached for his son's iPad. His first search of the year wasn't a resolution, it was a blueprint. How long before a body starts to smell? This digital confession, typed while his wife, Anna Walsh, reportedly slept nearby, was the first crumb in a trail that would lead police to a basement of horrors, and a secret that Google simply couldn't keep. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. The story of the Walsh family is one of two trajectories moving in opposite directions. One climbing toward the American dream, and the other spiraling into a void of entitlement and deceit. Anna Walsh, born Anna Knop in Belgrade, Serbia, was the personification of the immigrant success story. When she arrived in the United States in 2005, she brought nothing but a relentless work ethic and a magnetism that made her impossible to ignore in the hospitality world. She started at the front desk of the Wheatley Hotel in the Berkshires, but it wasn't long before she was managing the Four Seasons in Boston and Washington, D.C. By the time her name hit the headlines, she was a regional general manager for Tishman Speyer, an international real estate titan. She split her time between the halls of power in the nation's capital and her family home in Massachusetts, a powerhouse who appeared to have conquered every obstacle in her path. But behind the manicured lawn of their Cohasset home, her husband was a man whose life was built on a foundation of professional-grade manipulation. Brian Walsh did not have to climb. He was born into the upper echelons of Boston's elite. His father, Dr. Thomas Walsh, was a world-renowned neurologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, a man of immense prestige and wealth. Yet the relationship between father and son was a toxic cycle of betrayal that spanned decades. Brian wasn't just the black sheep, he was described by those close to the family as a calculated predator. Years before he would be fitted with an ankle monitor, Brian allegedly swindled his father out of nearly $1 million during a refinance deal for a home in Lenox. The theft was so profound that Dr. Walsh cut all ties, refusing to speak to his only son for over a decade. The depth of this estrangement was laid bare when Dr. Walsh died unexpectedly while traveling in India in 2018. His will was explicit. He left his son, his best wishes, but nothing else. However, the moment Brian learned of his father's passing, he didn't mourn, he moved. Prosecutors later detailed how Brian allegedly broke into his father's home in Hull, Massachusetts, before any other relatives could arrive. There, he reportedly destroyed the original will and convinced a probate court that he was the sole, rightful heir to the estate. By the time cousins and friends realized what had happened, Brian had already drained bank accounts of at least $250,000, sold off a Salvador Dali painting, a Miro, and even the family car. One family friend later told the court that Brian was a sociopath who had been diagnosed with psychological issues at the Austin Riggs Psychiatric Hospital, a man who once tried to smuggle antiquities out of China and reportedly attacked guards with a stanchion when he was caught. While Anna was building a legitimate empire, Brian was pivoting to international art fraud. In a scheme that would eventually place him under federal house arrest, Brian took authentic Andy Warhol paintings from a friend under the guise of selling them for a good price. Instead, he kept the originals and sold fakes on eBay. In 2016, a buyer in South Korea paid $80,000 for 2 Warhol Shadows paintings, only to realize the canvases and staples were brand new, and the promised authentication stamps were missing. Brian's response was a masterclass in stalling, offering a litany of excuses while the money disappeared into his own accounts. By 2021, the federal government had closed in. Brian pleaded guilty to wire fraud and other charges, but his sentencing was delayed, leaving him in a state of legal limbo. For the next year and a half, the Walsh family lived a bizarre paradox. On the surface, they were a high society couple with 3 young sons, living in an affluent coastal community. But inside, Brian was a prisoner of his own making, confined to the house with an ankle monitor, forced to ask the government for permission to take his children to school or buy groceries. Anna was the sole provider, the one flying back and forth to DC to maintain their lifestyle, while Brian sat in the shadows of their home, watching the woman he couldn't control thrive in a world he was no longer allowed to enter. It was a pressure cooker of resentment, greed, and a looming prison sentence. And by the end of 2022, the lid was about to blow. The romance began with the kind of cinematic flair Brian Walsh had perfected over a lifetime of mimicked sophistication. In 2008, Anna was the rising star of the Wheatley, a Gilded Age mansion turned luxury hotel nestled in the Berkshire Mountains. She was the manager, organized, ambitious, and vibrant. He was a guest, a man who seemed to occupy the space around him with the weight of old money and the quiet confidence of a Boston Brahmin. To a young woman who had moved from Belgrade to conquer the American hospitality industry, Brian appeared to be the ultimate prize, a man of culture, means, and stability. They were married in 2015, a union that appeared on social media to be an endless reel of high thread count sheets, sunset dinners, and the kind of effortless wealth that most people only see in magazines. For a time, the facade held. The couple moved into the affluent coastal enclave of Cohasset, eventually settling into a rental on Chief Justice Cushing Highway. The house was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar property that served as the perfect stage for their growing family. By 2022, they were the parents of 3 young boys, aged 6, 4, and 2. On the surface, the dynamic was modern and successful. Anna had transitioned from hotel management to a high-powered executive role at Tishman Speyer, a job that required her to spend significant time in Washington, D.C. She was the powerhouse, a woman who could command a boardroom and then fly home to be the devoted mother and wife. Her Instagram was a curated gallery of "life is beautiful" hashtags and smiling family portraits. But beneath the polished granite countertops and the designer clothes, the Walshy wealth was a house of cards held together by federal-grade lies. While Anna was out earning a legitimate 6-figure salary, Brian was embroiled in a legal nightmare that would have broken a man with a functioning moral compass. In 2016, Brian had orchestrated a brazen international art scam involving 2 authentic Andy Warhol paintings from the Shadows series. He had acquired the pieces from a former college roommate under the pretense of selling them for a fair price. Instead, Brian kept the originals and listed fakes on eBay. He used photographs of the real authentication stamps to lure in buyers, but the items he shipped were undeniable forgeries. A buyer in California and another in South Korea soon realized they had been swindled out of nearly $80,000. The federal investigation that followed stripped away the last of Brian's respectability. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to wire fraud, interstate transportation of stolen goods, and money laundering. However, his sentencing was delayed for nearly 2 years due to a variety of legal maneuvers and the complexities of his father's contested estate. This left Brian in a state of indefinite, high-stakes limbo. He was placed under federal house arrest, fitted with a GPS ankle monitor that tracked his every movement within the confines of the Cohasset property. He was a man who had once traveled the world on his father's dime, now reduced to asking a probation officer for permission to go to the grocery store or drop his kids at school. This house arrest created a toxic, inverted power dynamic. The man who craved control was now physically tethered to the floor, while his wife was reaching the peak of her career. Anna was flourishing, buying a townhouse in Washington, D.C., and pushing for the family to move there permanently so she could eliminate her grueling commute. Brian, however, was a legal anchor. He could not move to D.C. He was required to stay within the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts courts. To Brian, Anna's success wasn't something to be celebrated. It was a growing threat to his relevance. Every flight she took to D.C. was a reminder of his own imprisonment. Every dollar she earned was a reminder of the money he had stolen and lost. The financial pressure was also reaching a boiling point. Despite the luxury vehicles and the prestigious address, the Walshes were effectively broke. The legal fees were mounting, and Brian's ability to generate income was non-existent. The couple had reportedly spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a lifestyle they could no longer afford, and the looming threat of a prison sentence meant that the American dream Anna had worked so hard for was about to be liquidated by the federal government. Friends who visited the home during the final months of 2022 noticed a subtle, vibrating tension. Brian remained outwardly charming, the perfect host who could talk about art and wine for hours. But there was a sharpened edge to his demeanor. He began to monitor on his phone, his suspicions of her infidelity growing in direct proportion to his own insecurity. He wasn't just worried she was leaving him. He was worried she was taking the children, the remaining assets, and the last shred of his dignity with her. As the holidays approached, Anna was making plans for a future that clearly moved away from the shadow of Brian's criminal record. She had been searching for a new school for the boys in DC and had even secured a life insurance policy worth $2.2 million, with Brian as the sole beneficiary. To a man trapped in a house he couldn't leave, facing a prison cell he couldn't avoid, that policy wasn't just a safety net, it was an exit strategy. The golden couple of Cohasset was preparing for a New Year's Eve celebration, but while Anna was looking toward a fresh start in the capital, Brian was looking at the digital screen of his son's iPad, beginning a search for a very different kind of ending, one that involved a hacksaw, a tarp, and a question about the rate of decomposition in a cold basement. The transition from 2022 to 2023 in the Walsh household began with a performance that would have fooled even the most cynical observer. On New Year's Eve, the couple welcomed a close friend, Jem Mutlu, into their rented Cohasset home for a celebration that felt, on the surface, like an affirmation of their high society status. There was champagne, there was caviar, and there was the laughter of people who believed they were standing on the precipice of a brilliant new chapter. Mutlu later described the evening as remarkably normal, even festive. He saw a couple that appeared affectionate and a home that was filled with the warmth of the holiday spirit. When he walked out of the door around 1:30 a.m. on January 1st, he left behind a family that seemed to be at peace. But the moment the door clicked shut and the silence of the Massachusetts woods reclaimed the property, the festive mask was discarded, and the house on Chief Justice Cushing Highway became a laboratory for a savage, calculated erasure. According to the story Brian would later feed to the authorities, the morning of New Year's Day was a flurry of professional necessity. He claimed that Anna had been called away unexpectedly for a work emergency at her real estate firm in Washington, D.C. He described a scene where she kissed him goodbye around 6 a.m., heading to the door with her luggage in hand to summon a rideshare that would take her to Logan International Airport. It was a plausible tale for a high-powered executive whose life was dictated by the demands of the capital. But while Brian was painting this picture of a dedicated professional rushing toward her duties, the digital record was screaming a much darker truth. The American dream was being dismantled, one search query at a time, on an iPad that belonged to one of their young sons. The digital blueprint of the crime didn't begin at 6 a.m. It began in the pre-dawn darkness while the world was still recovering from the previous night's revelry. At 4:48 a.m., more than an hour before Brian claimed his wife had left the house, the first search was recorded. He didn't look for flight schedules or weather updates for DC. Instead, he reached out into the void of the internet to ask how long it would take before a body began to emit a noticeable scent. Minutes later, the queries became even more specific and more desperate. He sought information on the best ways to dispose of a body if one was truly in a bind, and he spent the early morning hours researching the legal precedents for murder charges in cases where a physical body had never been recovered. While his 3 children slept in the rooms nearby, Brian was essentially attending a masterclass in forensic evasion, guided by the cold light of a tablet screen. The timeline of that New Year's morning is a descent into a psychological abyss. By 9:29 a.m., he was inquiring about the rate of decomposition for a human remain. Shortly after, he moved on to the chemical specifics, researching the properties of formaldehyde and whether it could be used to preserve a body or if it would simply complicate the disposal process. By midday, the focus shifted from the biological to the mechanical. He spent the lunch hour looking for the most effective tools for dismemberment, specifically focusing on the utility of a hacksaw and the most efficient way to separate limbs from a torso. The man who had spent the previous evening sipping expensive champagne was now meticulously planning the physical destruction of the woman he had toasted just hours before. As the sun moved across the sky on January 1st, the void that Brian was creating began to expand into the physical world. Anna's phone, which usually hummed with the constant activity of her professional and social life, went silent. The last signal it emitted was around 3:14 a.m., pinging off a tower near the house, and then nothing. There was no record of an Uber or a Lyft being summoned to the property. There was no record of her boarding a flight at Logan Airport, and her credit cards, which she used with the frequency of a woman in constant motion, suddenly ceased all activity. The powerhouse executive had simply vanished from the digital grid, leaving behind only the frantic, ghoulish searches of a husband who is now obsessed with the weight of a body and the durability of plastic bags. The psychological chilling point of this block is the sheer, detached calm with which Brian operated. While he was researching how to remove blood from a wooden floor and whether luminol could detect traces of a cleanup even after the fact, he was also maintaining the mundane routine of a stay-at-home father. He was interacting with his children and speaking with his mother, all while the basement of the home was likely being transformed into a scene of unimaginable carnage. He wasn't just hiding a crime, he was living inside it. He inquired about what happens to hair on a dead body, and whether a body submerged in water would decompose faster than one buried in the woods. Each search was a cold, calculated step away from humanity. A man treating his wife's existence as a problem of physics and chemistry that needed to be solved before the holiday weekend ended. By the time the evening of January 1st arrived, the silence in the house was no longer the silence of sleep. It was the silence of a vacuum. Brian had spent the day not in mourning, but in a frantic, technical struggle against the reality of what he had done. He was a man under federal house arrest, a man tethered to his home by an ankle monitor, trying to figure out how to transport a dismembered body across town without alerting the government's GPS tracking system. The New Year's void wasn't just the absence of Anna, it was the total collapse of Brian's internal world, replaced by a singular predatory focus on the mechanics of death. As the first day of the year drew to a close, the digital trail was already cold, and the man who thought he could outsmart Google was standing in a house that now smelled of cleaning chemicals and secrets, waiting for the rest of the world to notice that the light of the Walsh family had gone out. The paradox of the day was that while Brian was looking for ways to make a person disappear, he was leaving behind a permanent, indestructible record of his own intent. Every time he hit search, he was signing a confession that the police wouldn't even need a body to prove. The tragedy was unfolding in the quietest way possible, behind a glowing screen in a cold basement under the cover of a coastal Massachusetts winter, as the mother of three was reduced to a series of data points and disposal methods. The days following New Year's were defined by two very different types of activity: the frantic digital pulse of a woman's professional world suddenly flatlining, and the slow, methodical movements of a man trying to sanitize a crime scene. From January 2nd to January 4th, the silence coming from the house in Cohasset was absolute. Anna Walsh, a woman whose life was a constant stream of emails, calls, and calendar alerts, had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. But for Brian, these 72 hours weren't spent in a panic over a missing wife. They were spent in a retail-fueled mission to erase her presence from the physical world. January 2nd should have been the day the alarm bells rang. It was the day Anna was supposedly in Washington, D.C., beginning her work week. Instead, it was the day Brian Walsh walked into a Home Depot in Rockland, Massachusetts, looking like a man prepared for a hazardous waste spill. Surveillance footage, which would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, captured Brian entering the store around 4 p.m. He was wearing a black surgical mask and blue surgical gloves, an outfit that in the tail end of the pandemic era might have seemed unremarkable until one looked at his cart. He didn't browse. He moved with a chilling, singular purpose. Brian spent over $450 in cash, a deliberate move to avoid leaving a digital paper trail, on a shopping list that read like a toolkit for a forensic nightmare. He purchased heavy-duty tarps, mops, buckets, and a staggering amount of cleaning agents. Most damning of all was the purchase of a Tyvek suit, the full-body white coveralls used by professional cleaners and laboratory technicians to prevent cross-contamination. To the cashier, he was just another homeowner tackling a messy basement project. To the investigators who would later review the tape, he was a man buying the equipment necessary to dismember a human being and scrub away the biological evidence. While Brian was loading mops and bleach into his Volvo, the silence from Anna's side was becoming deafening. Her phone remained dark. Her social media, usually a vibrant testament to her best life, was frozen on a New Year's Eve post. In the corporate offices of Tishman Speyer, colleagues were starting to exchange worried glances. Anna was the person who was always 10 minutes early, the one who never missed a briefing. For her to be unreachable for 24 hours was unusual. For her to be missing for 48 was unthinkable. Yet during this entire window, Brian made no attempt to contact her friends, her family, or the police. He didn't call the hospitals or the airlines. He simply went about his business, maintaining the facade of a busy stay-at-home father while the clock on his wife's life had already stopped. On January 3rd, Brian's movements took him further afield. He was spotted at a Whole Foods and a CVS, again wearing his mask and gloves, again moving with a quiet, detached efficiency. But it was his trip to his mother's apartment complex in Swampscott that would eventually yield the most grisly evidence. Surveillance cameras at a nearby apartment building captured a man matching Brian's description and driving his car, pulling up to a series of industrial trash bins. He was seen hauling heavy, overstuffed garbage bags out of his trunk and heaving them into the compactors. These weren't the bags of a man doing post-holiday cleaning. They were the discarded remains of a life. The silence was finally shattered on January 4th, but not by Brian. It was the security team at Tishman Speyer who finally contacted the Cohasset Police Department. They reported that one of their top executives had failed to show up for work in D.C. and hadn't been heard from since the start of the year. When the police finally reached out to Brian to ask why he hadn't reported his wife missing, his response was a masterpiece of casual indifference. He claimed he hadn't wanted to bother them, suggesting that perhaps she was just busy or had lost her phone. He told the officers the same story he would repeat until his arrest, that she had left at 6 a.m. on New Year's Day, whisked away by a rideshare toward an emergency that only she understood. When the first patrol car pulled into the driveway on Chief Justice Cushing Highway, the air in the house was reportedly thick with the scent of chemicals. Brian met the officers with a calm, almost helpful demeanor. He gave them a detailed timeline of his movements over the previous few days, mentioning trips to the grocery store and his mother's house. He appeared to be the picture of a concerned, if somewhat overwhelmed, husband. He even allowed them to walk through the house, a decision he would likely come to regret. Inside the home, the search began in earnest, though at first it was treated as a standard missing person case. But the detectives noticed things that didn't fit the narrative of a woman who had simply walked out the door. Her passport was still in the house. Her designer bags were in the closet. The luggage she supposedly took to D.C. was nowhere to be found, but neither were the cleaning supplies Brian had purchased just 2 days prior. The tension in the room shifted. The polite questions became more pointed. The 3-day gap, the silence, had given Brian a head start, but it had also given the evidence time to settle. While Brian was telling the police about his wife's work emergency, the digital forensics team was already discovering that no Uber or Lyft had ever been summoned to the house. The rideshare she supposedly took didn't exist. The airport shuttle he claimed she boarded hadn't seen her. The mask was beginning to slip. And as the police moved toward the basement, the smell of bleach became overwhelming. The search for a missing woman was about to turn into the excavation of a murder. The shift from a missing person inquiry to a homicide investigation happened with the sudden, jarring finality of a basement door swinging open. On January 8th, 2023, while Brian Walsh was being taken into custody for misleading investigators, forensic teams in white Tyvek suits, the very same suits Brian had purchased just days earlier, descended into the lower levels of the Cohasset home. What they found shattered any remaining hope that Anna had simply walked out of her life. In the heavy, chemical-laden air of the basement, investigators discovered a blood-stained area and a knife that bore traces of blood and biological material. The blade was damaged, bent, and chipped, as if it had been used with extreme, repetitive force against something much harder than wood or fabric. This was the midpoint pivot, the moment the detectives realized they weren't looking for a woman in Washington, D.C., but for the scattered remains of a woman who had never left the property. However, the physical evidence in the house was just the beginning. The real battle was happening in the digital and logistical trenches. Brian had told the police a detailed story about visiting his mother in Swampscott and taking his children out for ice cream. He was confident, almost arrogant, believing that his federal ankle monitor, which only tracked his location at specific intervals, would provide him with a good enough alibi. He was wrong. State police and crime scene technicians began a desperate needle-in-a-haystack operation that would span several Massachusetts towns. They knew that if Brian had disposed of evidence in industrial trash bins, time was their greatest enemy. In the world of waste management, trash doesn't sit still. It is compacted, hauled, and incinerated within hours. By the time the investigation gained momentum, the contents of the bins Brian had visited in Swampscott had already been transported to the Peabody Trash Transfer Station. The scene at Peabody was the grim reality of forensic labor. Dozens of investigators in hazmat gear spent days sifting through tons of stinking post-holiday refuse, manually tearing open thousands of black plastic bags in search of anything that looked like the items on Brian's Home Depot receipt. They weren't just looking for a body, they were looking for the murder kit. The breakthrough came with a discovery that was as heartbreaking as it was gruesome. Deep within the mountain of trash, they recovered heavy-duty garbage bags containing a series of items that definitively linked the basement in Cohasset to the waste plant in Peabody. Inside those bags were blood-stained rugs that matched the flooring of the Walsh home. There were cleaning cloths, mops, and the remains of the Tyvek suit Brian had been seen wearing on surveillance footage. But the most haunting finds were the personal effects, the fragments of a life interrupted. They found a Prada handbag that Anna had been known to carry. They found her COVID-19 vaccination card, still bearing her name in clear printed letters. And they found a hacksaw. When forensic analysts examined the tool, they found what they were looking for: human bone fragments and tissue caught in the teeth of the blade. The DNA results served as the final nail in the coffin of Brian's defense. The blood on the rug was Anna's. The tissue on the hacksaw was Anna's. The Google searches from New Year's Day, which the digital forensics team had finally fully extracted, now aligned perfectly with the physical evidence. When Brian had searched for the best tool to dismember, he had followed through with the hacksaw. When he searched for how to clean blood from a wooden floor, he had used the very mops recovered from the Peabody dump. The social echo in Cohasset was one of profound, paralyzed shock. This was a community of gated drives and quiet prestige, a place where this sort of thing simply didn't happen. Neighbors who had seen Brian walking his children just days after the murder felt a retrospective skin crawl. He hadn't been a man in mourning. He had been a man who had successfully, if temporarily, juggled the roles of father and butcher. The rumors began to swirl about the cursed nature of the house and the fate of the 3 young boys, who were now effectively orphans. As the investigation deepened, the red herrings Brian had planted began to crumble. He had claimed to have gotten lost while driving to his mother's house, which he used as an excuse for the extra time spent near the trash bins. But the GPS data from his phone and the timing of the surveillance footage showed a man who wasn't lost at all. He was a man on a route, a man who knew exactly where the nearest industrial compactors were located. He had tried to lead police on a wild goose chase regarding Anna's work emergency, but the lack of a single digital ping from her phone after 3:14 a.m. on January 1st proved that the emergency was entirely of his own making. The psychological depth of the investigation revealed a man who believed his intellect was superior to the collective power of the state. Brian Walsh had spent his life swindling art collectors and his own father, always believing he could talk his way out of a corner. But forensics doesn't listen to charm. The weight of the evidence, the Google confession, the blood-soaked rugs, the bone fragments on the saw, and the retail trail formed a circle around him that no amount of elitist posturing could break. By the time the district attorney was ready to present the case to a grand jury, they didn't just have a suspect, they had a digital and physical map of a cold-blooded execution. In March 2023, a Norfolk County grand jury indicted Brian Walsh on charges of murder, misleading a police investigation, and the improper conveyance of a human body. During his arraignment, the man who had once exuded the confidence of the Boston elite appeared hollowed out, though his composure remained eerily unshaken. As prosecutors read aloud the ghoulish list of search queries, the digital blueprints he had left behind, Brian stared ahead, his expression as flat and cold as the basement floor in Cohasset. He entered a plea of not guilty, his legal team suggesting the evidence was largely circumstantial and lacked the definitive weight of a physical body. Yet, the legal framework in Massachusetts allows for murder convictions without a corpse, provided the trail of evidence is compelling and conclusive. Currently held without bail, Brian Walsh awaits a trial that will likely become a landmark case in the intersection of forensic science and digital history. The man who tried to delete his wife found that the law, like the internet, never truly forgets. The house in Cohasset stands as a silent monument to a life meticulously erased. Anna Walsh's 3 sons are left with a legacy of absence. Their mother's remains a secret held by the earth. While Brian waits behind bars, the world remembers Anna not as a ghoulish data point, but as a woman of light who was betrayed by a predator in a designer suit. Brian's fatal error was believing he could outsmart the void, forgetting that in our digital age, the machines we trust are the ultimate witnesses to our darkest hours. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Canton, Massachusetts. A brutal blizzard is burying the suburbs, but on the manicured lawn of a veteran officer's home, a dark shape breaks the surface of the snow. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. It is the frozen body of Boston officer John O'Keefe. His skull shattered, his eyes swollen shut. While just steps away, his colleagues are inside celebrating. This isn't a simple accident. It is the opening shot of a legal civil war. A broken taillight on a luxury SUV will soon transform a professor into a calculated killer, or the victim of a massive multi-agency cover-up. In a town built on blue blood, the question remains, was he left to die, or was he discarded? Into this world of quiet sacrifice stepped Karen Reed. On paper, she was the demographic opposite of the insular, blue-collar police circles O'Keefe frequented. Reed was a woman of high intellect and corporate ambition, a Bentley University professor and an equity analyst for one of the world's largest investment firms. She navigated the high-stakes world of finance with a precision that made her a formidable figure in her field. However, her professional success masked a personal resilience forged through chronic health struggles. For years, Red had battled Crohn's disease, a condition that demanded a disciplined, often restrictive lifestyle. This wasn't a woman who lived recklessly. She was a woman who calculated risks, both in the market and in her daily health. When she and O'Keefe rekindled a connection during the early days of the pandemic, it seemed like a meeting of 2 stable forces. They were both in their 40s, both settled in their careers, and both seemingly ready for a partner who understood the weight of adult responsibilities. But the union wasn't without its friction points. Reed was moving into a ready-made family, a house in Mansfield that already had its own rhythms, its own history, and 2 children who were the center of O'Keefe's universe. The transition was complex. While the couple shared high-end vacations and a social life that spanned the affluent suburbs of Norfolk County, the daily grind of guardianship added a layer of pressure. There were whispers of arguments over the children, over the division of labor, and over the typical stresses that plague any relationship where 2 independent lives are forced to merge. Despite this, they remained a fixture in their social circle, a circle that was heavily dominated by the blue wall of the Boston Police Department. This social landscape is where the story becomes murky. The Canton Circle was a tight-knit web of law enforcement families, including the Alberts and the McCabe's. These were people who had grown up together, worked together, and protected one another. Brian Albert, a fellow Boston police officer, owned the home at 34 Fairview Road, the very house where the night would eventually end. To be in this circle was to be part of an unofficial brotherhood where loyalty was the highest currency. Karen Reed, the finance professional from outside the force, was always something of an outlier in this group. She was the civilian among officers, the academic among street cops. By the winter of 2022, the couple had been together for roughly 2 years, navigating the highs of companionship and the lows of suburban tension. They were two people trying to build a future in the shadow of a looming New England winter, unaware that the insular world they socialized in was about to become the site of a national controversy. The Mansfield home, once a sanctuary for O'Keefe's niece and nephew, was about to be left hollow, and the woman who shared his bed would soon be cast as his executioner. The relationship between Karen Reed and John O'Keefe was not a product of a whirlwind suburban romance. It was a revival, a second attempt at a spark that had first flickered nearly 2 decades earlier. Back in the mid-2000s, they had dated briefly as young professionals, but the timing was off, and their lives had drifted into different orbits. When they reconnected in 2020, the world was in the grip of a global standstill. The isolation of the pandemic acted as a strange, pressurized incubator. They found each other again on social media, two people now in their 40s, weary of the transient nature of modern dating and looking for something that felt like home. For Karen, O'Keefe represented a rare, grounded stability. He was a man of service, a protector by trade, and a devoted guardian to his orphaned niece and nephew. For O'Keefe, Reed was an intellectual equal, a woman whose financial acumen and professional independence were a stark, refreshing contrast to the often insular world of the Boston Police Department. By the time the snow began to accumulate in early 2022, the couple had spent nearly 2 years navigating a shared life in Mansfield. But their home was never truly theirs alone. It was a house defined by the presence of 2 teenagers and the heavy, lingering shadow of their loss. O'Keefe had transformed his bachelor existence into a relentless cycle of domestic duty, school schedules, sports practices, and the quiet, constant management of grief. Reed stepped into this ready-made family not just as a girlfriend, but as a provider. She reportedly spent tens of thousands of dollars on the children, funding vacations, electronics, and daily comforts that a police officer's salary could not always accommodate. She was seen at their games and school events, trying to weave herself into a family tapestry that had been torn and mended before her arrival. Yet beneath the surface of high-end dinners and suburban normalcy, the pressure was creating deep, jagged fractures. The transition from a fiercely independent corporate lifestyle to the role of a bonus parent is a massive psychological shift for anyone. But for Reed, it was compounded by the physical toll of her Crohn's disease. There were days when her body simply revolted, leaving her exhausted and in need of a quiet sanctuary that a house with 2 teenagers rarely provided. On the other hand, John O'Keefe was a creature of the blue wall. His sanctuary was not silence. It was the loud, boisterous camaraderie of the local bars in Canton and South Boston. He found his relief in the company of fellow officers, men like Brian Albert and Matthew McCabe, where the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and the rhythmic, aggressive cadence of police shop talk. Karen Reed was always something of an outsider in this brotherhood. She was the professor among street cops, the finance executive among men who prided themselves on blue-collar grit. This friction point allegedly became a flashpoint during a New Year's Eve getaway to Aruba just weeks before the tragedy. What was intended to be a romantic reprieve from the Massachusetts winter reportedly devolved into a theater of public conflict. Witnesses described a searing argument that erupted in the hotel lobby, a shouting match that left the rest of their social circle uncomfortable. Reed had allegedly observed O'Keefe in a conversation with the wife of another officer and, fueled by a mixture of exhaustion and deep-seated insecurity, reportedly accused him of infidelity in front of their peers. It wasn't just a spat, it was a fundamental breakdown of trust. Upon their return to the States, the atmosphere in the Mansfield home turned icy. O'Keefe reportedly confessed to friends that the relationship had become a source of constant stress, a burden he was no longer certain he wanted to carry, alongside the responsibility of raising his sister's children. He was reportedly seeking a graceful exit, a way to untangle their lives without causing further trauma to the household. Red, meanwhile, was described by some as becoming increasingly vigilant. Her messages to O'Keefe shifted between profound affection and sharp, biting resentment. She reportedly monitored his movements with a forensic intensity, questioning his loyalties and his whereabouts. They were trapped in a classic, exhausting cycle of breaking up and making up, their lives fused by shared finances and the needs of the children, while their emotional connection was fraying at the seams. The social dynamics of Canton added another layer of complexity. To be an Albert or a McCabe in that town was to be part of a local dynasty. They were the unofficial royalty of Norfolk County law enforcement, a tight-knit web of families who had grown up on the same streets and now patrolled them. When Red and O'Keefe socialized with this group, they were stepping into a world where loyalty to the circle was the highest currency. For a woman like Reed, who valued transparency and intellectual rigor, the unspoken rules and fierce protections of the Canton Circle must have felt like a foreign language. On the Friday before that fateful Saturday morning, the weather was not the only thing turning hostile. Reed had been navigating the demands of her high-stakes career, likely preoccupied with the social obligations of the upcoming weekend. O'Keefe was focused on the routine of the kids, the school runs, and the preparations for the massive storm that every meteorologist in the state was promising. There was no outward sign that this was the end of their story as a couple. They were simply two people in a failing relationship, moving through the motions of a Friday night in January. But as the first flakes of the nor'easter began to drift down through the streetlights of Canton, the stage was set for their private misery to explode into a national scandal. The blue wall was about to be tested, and the woman who had spent 2 years trying to find her place within it was about to be cast as its greatest enemy. The evening of Friday, January 28, 2022, began with the kind of restless energy that always precedes a major New England storm. Meteorologists had been sounding the alarm for days. A massive nor'easter was tracking toward the coast, promised to bury the suburbs of Boston under a foot or more of heavy, wet snow. In Canton, the air already held that metallic, biting chill that signals a deep freeze. For John O'Keefe, it was meant to be a reprieve, a night to step out of his role as a guardian and reconnect with the boisterous, blue-blooded world of his fellow officers. Around 9 p.m., he and Karen Reed arrived at C.F. McCarthy's, a local staple where the warmth of the bar and the hum of conversation offered a sharp contrast to the gathering dark outside. Surveillance footage from the establishment captured a couple that seemed, at least for the moment, in sync. They were seen at the bar, leaning into one another. O'Keefe in a casual pullover, Reed in a black top, both of them sharing the easy rhythmic gestures of people who had spent hundreds of evenings, just like this one. O'Keefe was drinking Tito's and soda, served in a tall glass with a lemon wedge, a detail that would later be scrutinized with forensic intensity. Red was seen with a glass of her own, a clear liquid that the prosecution would later argue was the beginning of a heavy night of consumption. They weren't alone for long. The social gravity of Canton meant that every few minutes, a familiar face would emerge from the crowd. They chatted with friends and colleagues, the atmosphere light and unburdened by the storm warnings flickering on the overhead televisions. But as the clock neared 11 p.m., the group decided to shift the scene across the street to the Waterfall Bar and Grill, a slightly more spacious venue that could better accommodate the growing circle of officers and their spouses. The walk across the street was short, but the wind was picking up, swirling the first few flakes of snow through the yellow glow of the streetlights. Inside the waterfall, the group expanded to include the heavy hitters of the local social scene. Brian Albert, a prominent Boston police officer, his wife, Nicole, and Jennifer McCabe, Nicole's sister, and a central figure in the web of Canton families. Also present was Brian Higgins, an agent with the ATF, who shared a close, if complicated, friendship with the couple. The group huddled around a high-top table near the back, the camaraderie typical of a tight-knit law enforcement circle. The footage from the waterfall shows O'Keefe and Reed moving through the space with comfort. At one point, they are seen embracing, a brief, cinematic moment of affection that would later be used by the defense to argue that there was no murderous intent in the air that night. As the bar's lights flickered for last call just after midnight, an invitation was extended. The Alberts were heading back to their home at 34 Fairview Road for an after-party. It was a casual gathering to mark Brian Albert Jr.'s 23rd birthday, and the group was encouraged to follow. For O'Keefe and Reed, it was a decision that would change everything. At 12:11 a.m., surveillance cameras captured them leaving the waterfall together. They stepped out into a world that had transformed in the 3 hours they'd been inside. The blizzard had officially arrived. The ground was now a slick, white sheet, and the air was a chaotic blur of driving snow. They climbed into Red's luxury Lexus LX 570, a heavy 3-ton SUV designed to handle exactly these conditions. The engine's low growl was masked by the howling wind as they pulled away from the curb. Red was behind the wheel, navigating the intensifying whiteout, while O'Keefe sat in the passenger seat, likely checking his phone for the address. They weren't entirely sure of the way. Jennifer McCabe later testified that she spoke with O'Keefe over the phone around 12:14 a.m. to provide specific directions to the Fairview residents. The drive was roughly 2 miles, a journey that usually takes 6 minutes but felt much longer as the Lexus's headlights struggled to cut through the wall of white. At 12:24 a.m., the heavy SUV pulled up to the curb in front of 34 Fairview Road. The house was a large colonial-style home, its windows glowing with the party inside, but the exterior was a dark, frozen landscape. What happened in the next 10 minutes remains the black hole at the center of this case. According to the prosecution's timeline, the Lexus didn't stay parked for long. They argue that within minutes of arriving, a violent confrontation occurred, or perhaps a tragic alcohol-fueled mistake that ended with Red backing her massive vehicle into O'Keefe, striking him with enough force to shatter the taillight and send him sprawling onto the front lawn. However, a different scene was being observed by those outside. Ryan Nagel, who had driven to the house with 2 friends in a Ford F-150 to pick up his sister, testified to seeing the black Lexus idling at the curb. He stated that he saw a woman, Karen Reed, sitting in the driver's seat alone. He described the vehicle's movements as safe and deliberate, noting that he didn't see any sign of a struggle or a body in the snow as they pulled away. Inside the Albert home, the party was in full swing, yet every person in that house, nearly a dozen witnesses, would later testify that they never saw John O'Keefe enter. They saw the Lexus outside, they saw the headlights, but the gentle giant never walked through the door. By 12:32 a.m., the Lexus was gone. Karen Red had allegedly grown impatient or frustrated when O'Keefe didn't return to the car, and she began the treacherous drive back to O'Keefe's home in Mansfield. Her phone records show the device connecting to his home Wi-Fi at 12:36 a.m., a 4-minute journey that the prosecution claims was a frantic flight from a crime scene, while the defense argues it was the actions of a woman who assumed her boyfriend had simply stayed at the party without her. As Reed walked onto the hardwood floors of the quiet house in Mansfield, the storm was reaching its peak. Back at 34 Fairview Road, the front lawn was becoming a graveyard. John O'Keefe lay in the grass just feet from the roadway, his body slowly being entombed by the relentless snowfall. He was dressed for a bar, not a blizzard. No hat, no gloves, and only a single shoe remained on his foot. The other was nowhere to be seen. The people inside the house continued their celebration, oblivious, or perhaps, as the defense suggests, very much aware that a brother in arms was cooling in the dark just outside their front door. The silence of the Mansfield home and the roar of the Canton wind were the only witnesses to the transition from a Friday night out to a life-shattering tragedy. The silence inside John O'Keefe's Mansfield home broke just before 5 a.m. Karen Red had drifted into a restless sleep on the couch, still wearing the clothes from the night before. But the realization that the bed upstairs was empty hit her with the force of a physical blow. The storm was still raging outside, a relentless wall of white, and her boyfriend, a man of rigid habits and deep responsibility toward the children sleeping in the rooms above, had vanished. Between 4:33 a.m. and 5 a.m., Reed's panic manifested in a digital blizzard of her own. She placed 53 calls to O'Keefe's cell phone, each one sliding into a voicemail that would never be checked. Her voice, captured in the recordings, transitioned from irritation to a jagged, high-pitched terror. Desperate for answers, Red reached out to the woman who had been the social architect of the previous night, Jennifer McCabe. When McCabe answered her phone at 5:07 a.m., she was met with a woman who sounded completely unmoored. Red was screaming, her thoughts tangled in a dark web of possibilities. She told McCabe that John hadn't come home, that she didn't know where she had left him. In a detail that would later become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, McCabe claimed that Red looked out at her Lexus LX 570 idling in the driveway and noticed a cracked rear taillight, wondering aloud if she could have hit him. By 5:30 a.m., a search party of 3 women had formed in the pre-dawn gloom: Red, Jennifer McCabe, and Carrie Roberts, another close friend of O'Keefe. They navigated the treacherous, unplowed streets of Canton in Roberts' vehicle, the windshield wipers struggling against the freezing crust of the nor'easter. The conversation inside the car was a frantic loop of speculation. Red was reportedly inconsolable, her eyes fixed on the drifts of snow passing the window. They checked the route they had taken, peered into the dark windows of the Waterfall bar, and finally, as the first gray light of a miserable Saturday morning began to bleed into the sky, they turned onto Fairview Road. The Albert residence at number 34 was a dark silhouette against the white landscape. As the car slowed, Red screamed for Roberts to stop. Despite the near-zero visibility and the heavy accumulation of snow, Reed claimed to see a dark shape on the lawn. She bolted from the vehicle before it had fully settled, her feet sinking deep into the drifts. Behind her, McCabe and Roberts followed, their breath hitching in the frigid air. There, lying on his back beneath a light shroud of fresh powder, was John O'Keefe. The scene was a visceral, frozen nightmare. O'Keefe's body was positioned roughly 12 feet from the curb, his arm extended as if reaching for a door that was no longer there. His face was a mask of trauma. His eyes were swollen, a deep, bruised purple, and a cluster of jagged lacerations marked his right arm. He was missing a shoe. The gentle giant was cold to the touch, his body already stiffening in the New England frost. Red collapsed onto him, her screams muffled by the roar of the wind, attempting to use her own body heat to breathe life back into a man who had likely been dead for hours. In the chaotic minutes that followed, Jennifer McCabe dialed 911. Her voice was frantic as she reported a man down in the snow, unresponsive and dead cold. As they waited for the sirens to pierce the storm, McCabe and Roberts later testified to a series of haunting outbursts from Reed. They claimed she was walking in circles, her hands over her mouth, repeating a rhythmic, devastating confession. "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." To the prosecution, this was the spontaneous utterance of a guilty woman. To the defense, it was a hysterical question, a woman in shock trying to make sense of a world that had just collapsed, asking, "Did I hit him?" First responders arrived at 6:04 a.m., their boots crunching on the frozen lawn as they pushed through the crowd of hysterical women. They found O'Keefe in cardiac arrest, his core temperature so low it didn't even register on their initial equipment. As the paramedics worked to stabilize him, clearing the snow from his airway and beginning the rhythmic compressions of CPR, they noted a bizarre detail. The lawn of 34 Fairview Road remained eerily quiet. Despite the flashing blue and red lights, the wail of the sirens, and the shouting of emergency crews, the front door of the Albert home, the home of a fellow Boston police officer, remained shut. No one from the after-party emerged to see what the chaos was about. No one stepped out into the cold to help a brother in arms. By the time the ambulance pulled away, headed for Good Samaritan Medical Center, the investigation had already begun in the snow. A Canton police officer, shielded from the wind by his cruiser, noticed several pieces of broken red and clear plastic scattered near the spot where O'Keefe had been found. They were the jagged remains of a vehicle's taillight. As the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, the blue wall began to settle around Fairview Road, and the woman who had spent the morning searching for her boyfriend was about to become the primary suspect in his murder. The discovery of the body was the end of the search, but it was the beginning of a conspiracy theory that would set the entire state of Massachusetts on fire. The investigation into the death of John O'Keefe began not with a meticulous forensic sweep, but with a series of makeshift decisions that would later haunt the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. As the ambulance sped away from 34 Fairview Road, the Canton police and state police investigators faced a crime scene that was rapidly disappearing under inches of fresh snow. In a detail that would become an emblem of the defense's argument, investigators reportedly collected blood samples from the snow using red Solo cups borrowed from a neighbor, sealing them with duct tape. This lack of standard forensic protocol was the first crack in a case that was about to become a chasm. Lead investigator Michael Proctor of the Massachusetts State Police took the reins of the case almost immediately. To the public, he was a veteran investigator. To the defense, he was a walking conflict of interest. Proctor, it was later revealed, had deep-seated social ties to the Albert family. His wife was close friends with the family inside the house where O'Keefe's body was found, and he had socialized in the same tight-knit Canton circles for years. Despite this, he did not recuse himself. Instead, he steered the narrative toward a single conclusion. Karen Reed had killed her boyfriend in a fit of drunken rage. The prosecution's theory was built on the physical evidence found in the drifts. They pointed to the shards of red and clear plastic discovered near O'Keefe's head, jagged pieces that a state lab later matched to the broken taillight of Reed's Lexus LX570. They argued that the vehicle's internal computer data showed a reverse event at 12:42 a.m., claiming Reed accelerated backward at 24 miles per hour, striking O'Keefe with the rear of the 3-ton SUV and sending him spiraling into the grass. By early February, the initial charge of manslaughter was upgraded to second-degree murder. But then, the defense team, led by high-profile attorneys Alan Jackson and David Yannetti, began to pull at the threads of the blue wall. They didn't just argue for Reed's innocence. They alleged a massive multi-agency cover-up designed to protect one of their own. They pointed to the wounds on O'Keefe's right arm, a series of parallel jagged lacerations that didn't resemble the blunt force trauma of a car bumper. Instead, they brought in forensic experts who suggested the marks were consistent with animal scratches, specifically a dog. The Alberts owned a German Shepherd named Chloe at the time of the incident, a dog that was reportedly rehomed across state lines shortly after the investigation began. The midpoint pivot in the investigation came through a digital bombshell. Forensic experts hired by the defense examined the cell phone of Jennifer McCabe. They claimed to find a Google search performed at 2:27 a.m., 3 hours before the body was officially discovered. The search query was chilling. Hose long to die in cold. While the prosecution's experts argued this was a timestamp glitch caused by an open browser tab from later that morning, the damage was done. To the growing Free Karen Reed movement, this was proof of a conspiracy. They argued O'Keefe had been beaten inside the Albert home, attacked by the dog, and then dragged out into the snow to die, while the party guests coordinated their stories. As the case moved through 2023, the investigation expanded into the federal realm. The U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI launched an independent probe into the integrity of the local investigation, a move virtually unheard of in a state murder case. This federal intervention yielded a 3,000-page report that reportedly contained expert testimony from independent accident reconstructionists. These experts, who had no ties to either side, concluded that the damage to the Lexus and the injuries to O'Keefe were physically impossible to achieve through a vehicle strike at 24 miles per hour. They suggested that O'Keefe's head trauma, a massive fracture to the rear of his skull, was more consistent with a fall onto a hard surface, like a basement floor, than a collision with a plastic taillight. The community of Canton became a powder keg. Local atmosphere shifted from quiet suburban mourning to a town under siege by truth seekers and protesters. Aidan Kearney, a local blogger known as Turtle Boy, amplified the defense's claims, leading to a surge of protesters in pink shirts, Reed's signature color, lining the streets outside the Norfolk County Courthouse. Rumors of burner phones, deleted text messages, and basement floors being replaced in the Albert home circulated like wildfire. The lead investigator himself, Michael Proctor, was eventually forced to admit during a deposition that he had sent derogatory, unprofessional texts about Red to his colleagues, calling her crazy and making disparaging remarks about her medical condition. The frustration of the detectives was palpable as their slam-dunk hit-and-run case transformed into a referendum on police corruption. Every piece of evidence was now viewed through a lens of suspicion. Did the taillight fragments appear in the snow only after the police seized Reed's car? Why did the ring camera footage from O'Keefe's driveway appear to have a gap at the exact moment Reed was seen leaving to search for him? The investigation had become a hall of mirrors. The why and how of John O'Keefe's final moments were no longer just a legal question. They were a cultural obsession, fueled by the paradox of a man left to freeze in a town where the police were supposed to be the ones who kept watch. The 2024 trial of Karen Reed was a televised collision of two opposing realities. For 10 weeks, the Canton Circle took the stand, defending their family names, while the prosecution painted Red as a scorned woman who used her 3-ton SUV as a weapon. But the foundation of the Commonwealth's case crumbled under the testimony of its own lead investigator, Michael Proctor. He was forced to confront his own toxicity, reading aloud private, disparaging text messages about the woman he was investigating. Despite the forensic debates over taillight shards and digital timestamps, the jury reached a stalemate. On July 1st, 2024, the judge declared a mistrial. The verdict was no verdict at all. Canton remains a town fractured by the blue wall and a movement in pink, while the defense fights for the dismissal of charges based on claims that the jury had actually reached a secret consensus to acquit on 2 counts. The legal clock has reset. In 2025, the battle begins again. The lawn at 34 Fairview Road is clear now, the snow long since melted, but the house remains a monument to a mystery with no easy exit. For John O'Keefe's family, the courtroom isn't a sanctuary. It's a battlefield where his memory is caught between 2 warring versions of the truth. Whether Karen Red is a killer or a scapegoat, one reality remains. A protector was left in the cold while his own circle celebrated inside. In Canton, justice isn't just blind, it's buried under the weight of the blue wall and the echoes of a storm that never really ended. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. On April 2nd, 2024, the jagged shoreline of Lake Michigan at Warnemont Park surrendered a secret that would freeze the blood of Milwaukee. A passerby, expecting the usual lakefront debris, instead found a severed human leg, removed with chilling precision. This wasn't a random act of street violence. It was the final chapter of a first date. 19-year-old Sadie Robinson had spent the previous evening sharing a seafood dinner, unaware she was sitting across from a dismemberer. Maxwell Anderson hadn't just ended her life. He had begun a calculated attempt to dismantle her entire existence. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the horror that unfolded on the shores of Lake Michigan, one must first look at the 2 lives that were destined to collide in the most violent way imaginable. Sade Robinson was the embodiment of ambition, a 19-year-old who moved through the streets of Milwaukee with a purpose that many her age had yet to find. She was a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, her sights set firmly on a career in criminal justice. Her mother often remarked on her daughter's fierce independence, describing her as a young woman who refused to let anyone dictate her pace or dampen her spirit. To Sade, the world was an organized place, or at least it was supposed to be, and she spent her hours studying the very laws meant to protect citizens, unaware that she would soon become the center of a case that would test the limits of those very statutes. Her daily routine was a testament to a tireless work ethic. She held a position at Pizza Shuttle, a local landmark on the city's east side, where the air was a constant mix of toasted flour and industrial tomato sauce. She wasn't merely an employee there, she was a vibrant, essential presence, recognized by her coworkers for the pride she took in her distinct Honda Civic and her ability to brighten the room. Her friends saw a woman who loved the finer points of life, fashion, music, and the simple joy of an evening out, but who was also deeply disciplined about her future. She was only weeks away from a graduation ceremony that symbolized her transition into the professional world she so admired. A daughter of the South who had moved from Mississippi to Wisconsin, she had built a life based on potential and the warmth she offered to everyone in her social circle. In sharp, jagged contrast stood Maxwell Anderson. At 33, he was a man whose life appeared to be a series of diminishing returns and discarded opportunities. He resided in a two-story home on North 33rd Street, a property owned by his father, who was a successful and well-regarded local businessman. The house was an unassuming structure on the city's west side, sitting quietly on a tree-lined street, yet the atmosphere within its walls was far from peaceful. Anderson had spent much of his adult life drifting through the service industry, most notably working as a bartender at several high-profile Milwaukee venues. To the patrons he served, he was merely a face behind the mahogany, a man who could hold a brief conversation, but often left people with an inexplicable sense of unease. His co-workers, however, were far less charitable in their assessments, recalling a man with a hair-trigger temper who could oscillate between professional competence and terrifying, unprovoked outbursts of rage in a matter of seconds. Anderson's personal history was a ledger of warning signs that had been accumulating for years. His criminal record included past incidents of domestic battery and disorderly conduct, pointing toward a deep-seated struggle with impulse control and an inherent disregard for the safety of others. He was a man who felt a constant sense of entitlement to his space and his opinions, often clashing violently with anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Those who had known him intimately spoke of a suffocating, controlling nature that defined his romantic relationships. He seemed obsessed with maintaining a veneer of normalcy, yet his private life was a chaotic mess of simmering resentment and a perceived lack of the success his father had achieved. This gap between his reality and his ego appeared to fuel a desire for a different, darker kind of power, the kind that comes from total dominance over another human being. The Milwaukee that Sade navigated was one of community and progress, defined by the hum of the campus library and the frantic energy of a busy pizza shop. For her, the city was a map of opportunities waiting to be seized. For Maxwell, the city was something else entirely. It was a landscape masked by the mundane, where he could observe the social rhythms of the young women who frequented the bars where he worked. He was a man who understood the digital world, using social media and dating apps to bridge the gap between his isolated house and the vibrant world Seda inhabited. He had learned how to wear the skin of a normal man, a bartender who knew how to listen just enough to make a stranger feel safe in his presence. In the weeks leading up to April 2024, Sade was focused on finalizing her academic projects and looking forward to a life in law enforcement. She was a young woman who genuinely believed in the system of justice. Maxwell, conversely, was retreating further into his own dark contemplations. His house on 33rd Street had become a setting where his long-held fantasies and his history of violence were beginning to coalesce into a dangerous intent. He was not a man who had suddenly lost his grip on reality. He was a man who had been methodically building a monument to his own darkness for over a decade. The tragedy of Sade Robinson was not just that she encountered a killer, but that she met a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of hiding a predatory nature behind the most ordinary of masks. The digital landscape of 2024 served as the hunting ground where the paths of Sade Robinson and Maxwell Anderson first began to intertwine. In an era where human connection is often mediated by the glow of a smartphone screen, their initial interaction was as mundane as it was ultimately catastrophic. They met through a dating application, a platform designed to foster romance that, in this instance, became a gateway for a predator. To Sade, Maxwell likely appeared as just another potential suitor in the bustling Milwaukee social scene, a 33-year-old with deep roots in the city, a man who possessed the conversational polish of a seasoned bartender. Their early correspondence was a masterclass in the mask of normalcy that Maxwell had spent decades refining. He portrayed himself as someone grounded yet adventurous, utilizing the specific cadence of modern dating apps to build a sense of rapid, unearned intimacy. He asked the right questions, mirrored her interests, and projected a version of himself that was safe and approachable. For Sade, The interaction was filled with the usual optimism of a young woman looking for a meaningful connection. She shared details about her studies and her aspirations in criminal justice, unknowingly providing her interlocutor with the very profile he would eventually seek to destroy. Friends would later recall that she seemed genuinely interested in the man who appeared to be so attentive to her life. She mentioned to those closest to her that she had a date planned with someone who seemed different from the usual crowd. However, beneath the surface of these digital exchanges, a much darker reality was simmering in the house on North 33rd Street. Maxwell Anderson was not looking for a partner. He was searching for a target. His history of domestic outbursts and controlling behavior suggests that his interest in Sade was rooted in a psychological need for dominance rather than any genuine romantic impulse. In the days leading up to their meeting, Maxwell's digital footprint revealed a man increasingly isolated within his own disturbing thoughts. He was a regular in the city's nightlife, but he was always an outsider looking in, a man who felt the world owed him a level of success and admiration that his own volatile personality constantly sabotaged. The preparation for this meeting was a study in horrific duality. On one side of the city, Sade was preparing for an evening out with the excitement typical of a 19-year-old. She picked out her outfit with care, checked her hair in the mirror, and sent a selfie to her friends to show off her look for the night. She was a woman who lived in the light, a person who documented her joy and her progress with a sense of transparency. She saw April 1st not as a day for pranks, but as the beginning of a new month, a step closer to her college graduation. She moved through her apartment with a sense of rhythm, perhaps playing music as she got ready, the four walls of her home filled with the energy of a life just beginning to bloom. Across town, the atmosphere in Maxwell Anderson's home was cold and clinical. While he likely spent some time ensuring his own physical appearance met the standards of a respectable date, the true preparation was happening in the recesses of his mind and the dark corners of his basement. This was a man who understood the geography of his own house as a tactical space. The entitlement he felt over his surroundings, a house provided by his father, extended to the people he invited inside. Investigators would later scrutinize the state of his residence, finding evidence that suggested his environment was organized for something far more sinister than a simple home-cooked meal or a post-date drink. He wasn't just planning a dinner, he was orchestrating an encounter where he would have total control over the variables. The choice of April 1st for their meeting adds a layer of bitter irony to the tragedy. As the city of Milwaukee prepared for the usual lightheartedness of the day, these two individuals were finalizing the logistics of a meeting that would result in the death of one and the lifelong incarceration of the other. They agreed to meet at Duke's on Water, a popular downtown spot known for its casual atmosphere and seafood. The location was strategic for Maxwell. It was a public place where he could continue to perform his nice guy persona, a neutral ground where Sade would feel comfortable enough to eventually leave her own vehicle behind and step into his. Their final messages on the afternoon of April 1st were brief and functional, focused on timing and arrival. There was no indication in Sade's tone that she felt any trepidation, no last-minute hesitation that suggested her intuition was screaming. She trusted the process of the app, the safety of the public venue, and the seemingly harmless identity of the man she had been messaging. For Maxwell, those final clicks and swipes were the closing of a trap. He was a man who had spent his life failing to achieve greatness through legitimate means, and he had now turned toward a horrific, perverse form of achievement through the destruction of another. As the sun began to set over the Milwaukee skyline, the digital connection was about to become a physical reality. Sade Robinson climbed into her Honda Civic, a car she took immense pride in, and began the drive toward downtown. She was moving toward what she believed was a standard first date, a chance to enjoy a meal, share some stories, and perhaps find a spark. She was traveling toward a man who had already decided her fate, a man who viewed her not as a person with dreams and a family, but as a vessel for his own incomprehensible rage. The connection they had built over the previous days was a bridge made of glass, and Sade was walking across it with the confidence of the innocent, unaware of the abyss Maxwell Anderson had dug beneath her feet. The calendar read April 1st, 2024. a date usually reserved for harmless deceptions. But as the sun dipped below the Milwaukee skyline, a very real and irreversible sequence of events began to unfold. For Sade Robinson, the evening started with the standard rituals of a 19-year-old preparing for a night out. She moved through her apartment with an energy fueled by the anticipation of a first date, unaware that every choice she made, the clothes she picked, the messages she sent, the route she took, was being etched into a timeline that investigators would later obsess over. She was dressed in a white sweatshirt and light-colored pants, a bright ensemble that stood out against the darkening streets. Shortly before 9 in the evening, she climbed into her black Honda Civic, a vehicle that represented her independence and hard-earned success, and began the drive toward the heart of the city. The destination was Duke's on Water, a staple of the Milwaukee nightlife, located in the bustling downtown district. The air that evening carried the sharp, lingering chill of a Wisconsin spring, the kind of cold that makes the warmth of a crowded bar feel like a sanctuary. Sade arrived and found Maxwell Anderson already waiting. To anyone glancing at the booth, they were just another pair of strangers navigating the awkward, polite dance of a first meeting. The surveillance footage from inside the establishment would later become a haunting artifact of this normalcy. It showed a man and a woman sitting across from each other, sharing a seafood dinner. They appeared engaged, the conversation flowing between bites of food and sips of drinks. Maxwell, drawing on years of experience behind various bars in the city, performed the role of the attentive listener with practiced ease. He leaned in, he nodded, he maintained the level of eye contact that signals interest without crossing into the territory of the unsettling. For nearly 90 minutes, they existed in this public bubble. The ambient noise of the bar, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of other patrons' lives, the occasional burst of laughter from the bar, provided a thick layer of social safety. Sade seemed comfortable. She wasn't checking her phone for an exit strategy. She wasn't looking toward the door with apprehension. She was a woman who lived by the rules of criminal justice she was studying, and in this well-lit public space, there were no rules being broken. Maxwell remained the consummate professional of the nice guy persona. He didn't rush the meal. He didn't exhibit the hair-trigger temper that had defined his past. He was patient. He was waiting for the moment the social safety net would be withdrawn. Around 10:30 p.m., the atmosphere of the date shifted from the public to the private. The decision was made to leave Duke's, and it is here that the tactical nature of Maxwell's plan became evident. Sade didn't drive her own car to the next location. Instead, she left her Honda Civic parked near the bar, a beacon of her identity left behind in the downtown shadows, and stepped into Maxwell's vehicle. This move, while common in the world of dating, effectively stripped Sade of her mobility and her primary means of escape. They began the drive toward the west side, moving away from the security of the crowds and toward the quiet residential isolation of North 33rd Street. The drive took them through streets that Maxwell knew intimately, past the bars where he had worked, and the neighborhoods where he had lived out his frustrated ambitions. As they pulled up to the two-story house, the silence of the neighborhood likely felt like a natural transition from a long evening of talking. The house, a property that symbolized both his father's success and his own stagnation, sat under the yellow glow of a street lamp. Inside, the environment was vastly different from the warmth of the restaurant. It was a space Maxwell controlled entirely, a domain where his impulses were no longer moderated by the presence of witnesses. The timeline of what happened behind those closed doors is a grim reconstruction based on digital footprints and forensic gaps. Sade's phone, which had been active throughout the evening, began to fall silent. The vibrant stream of communication she maintained with her world, the check-ins with friends, the social media updates, petered out as she crossed the threshold of the house on 33rd Street. Maxwell's presence in the house was not that of a host, but of a predator who had finally secured his quarry in his lair. The sensory details of that final hour are lost to the silence of the house, but the physical evidence later recovered paints a picture of a sudden and violent transition. The basement, a utilitarian space of concrete and shadows, would become the focus of the most intense forensic scrutiny. It was here that the date night killer shed the skin of the polite bartender and embrace the monster that had been simmering beneath his surface for years. There were no more polite nods or shared stories. There was only the terrifying reality of a man who viewed human life as something that could be dismantled and discarded. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the city of Milwaukee slept, unaware that a block away from its main thoroughfares, a horrific crime was being committed with methodical cruelty. Maxwell Anderson was not acting in a heat of passion. His actions over the following hours suggested a cold, clinical detachment. He began the process of attempting to erase Sade Robinson, not just from the world of the living, but from the physical record entirely. The precision with which he worked hinted at a dark preoccupation with anatomy and the mechanics of disposal. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a man who sought to undo the very humanity of his victim. Outside, the neighborhood remained still. No neighbors reported screams. No one noticed anything unusual about the house on 33rd Street. Maxwell had ensured that the final act of this date was a solitary one. By the time the first hints of dawn began to gray the sky on April 2nd, the bright, ambitious young woman who had walked into Duke's on water with a smile was gone. In her place was a crime scene that would soon defy the comprehension of even the most seasoned investigators. Maxwell Anderson sat in the silence of his home, surrounded by the remnants of his horrific work, already beginning to calculate his next move: the disposal of the evidence and the burning of the car that still sat as a silent witness to the woman he had just destroyed. The silence of April 2nd didn't begin with a scream, it began with a void. At Pizza Shuttle, the morning shift was in full-blown motion, the scent of rising dough and industrial ovens filling the air. But the familiar black Honda Civic was missing from its usual spot. Sade Robinson was many things, but she was never late. By noon, the silence from her phone transformed from a minor curiosity into a cold, creeping dread that settled in the stomachs of everyone who knew her. Her manager, acutely aware of the 19-year-old's meticulous nature and her excitement for her upcoming graduation, reached out to her mother, Sheena Scarborough. It was the first pebble in an avalanche. Sade's mother tried the phone. No answer. She tried the Life 360 tracking app. The digital beacon that usually pinned Sade to a specific coordinate was stagnant, eventually pointing toward a residential area on the west side that held no significance to the family. It was a digital dead end that whispered of something gone wrong. The first physical sign that the first date had spiraled into a nightmare appeared around 7:30 that morning, while the city was just waking up to its morning coffee. The Milwaukee Fire Department received an urgent call to the corner of 29th and Lisbon Avenue. A car was engulfed in flames, the black paint bubbling and peeling under the intense heat of an accelerant-fueled blaze. When the fire was finally suppressed, leaving a skeleton of scorched metal and the acrid stench of burnt rubber, investigators looked at the charred remains of a Honda Civic. The interior was a blackened husk. The seats, the personal belongings, the very DNA of the vehicle's owner were being scrubbed away by the fire. It wasn't just a car fire, it was a forensic erasure. The license plate, miraculously spared enough to be read, confirmed the family's worst fears. It was Sade's car. But Sade was nowhere to be found. While the police were processing the scorched metal on the west side, the community was already mobilizing with a ferocity that only comes from a collective sense of injustice. This wasn't a girl who ran away. This was a girl who had a graduation gown waiting for her, a girl with a plan. Her mother and friends began a frantic, grassroots search, moving between the last known pings of her phone and the site of the burned car. They knocked on doors, they checked alleyways, and they screamed her name into the biting Milwaukee wind. The response from the authorities, initially measured as they processed the car fire, shifted into high gear as the realization set in that a 19-year-old college student had vanished simultaneously with the destruction of her most prized possession. Then came the moment that changed the investigation from a search for a missing person to the recovery of a victim. It happened nearly 5 miles away from the burned car, on the tranquil, wind-swept shores of Lake Michigan. At Warnemont Park in Kudai, a bystander was walking along the bluff, looking out over the gray, churning expanse of the water. Beneath the bluffs, near a pumping station, something caught their eye, a shape that didn't belong to the natural geography of the beach. It was a human leg, severed just below the hip with a chilling surgical precision. The limb was pale, pristine despite its violent separation, and it bore a distinct, heartbreaking mark of identity. The toenails were painted with a fresh, vibrant polish, a detail that matched the description of the girl who had dressed so carefully for a date the night before. The discovery at the park sent a shockwave through the local precinct. The geographical disconnect was baffling and pointed toward a predator who knew the city's layout all too well. A car burned on the north side, a limb found on the south side. The killer was using the city as a map for his disposal, tossing fragments of a life into different zip codes as if he were trying to confuse the very compass of justice. As the sun set on April 2nd, the park was cordoned off with yellow tape, the silence of the nature preserve broken by the static of police radios and the heavy boots of forensic teams. For the Robinson family, the news of the leg was a crushing blow, yet they refused to surrender to despair. Until a full body was found, they clung to the impossible hope that the forensic evidence belonged to someone else. But the reality was settling in like a heavy, suffocating fog. The girl who had been studying the mechanics of crime was now the subject of the city's most gruesome file. The search continued through the night, with divers braving the frigid, unforgiving waters of the lake and drones hovering over the dense brush of the park. Every piece of clothing found, every discarded bag, was treated with the reverence of a holy relic. The search was no longer just about Sade, it was about the man she had been seen with. While the family searched the woods, detectives were pulling the security footage from Duke's On Water. They were looking at the man in the booth, the man who had shared the seafood, the man who was now the only person who knew where the rest of Sade Robinson was hidden. The city was on edge. Rumors of a date night killer began to circulate through the college campuses, turning the once safe practice of meeting strangers into a source of paralyzing fear. Maxwell Anderson had remained silent, but the trail he left, the smoke from the Civic and the blood on the beach, was beginning to speak for him. The search was narrowing, moving from the vast expanse of Lake Michigan back toward the house on North 33rd Street. The emotional toll on the community during those first 48 hours was visceral. Milwaukee is a city of neighborhoods, and the disappearance of a young woman who had made the city her home felt like a collective injury. The pizza shuttle became a makeshift vigil site, with regulars and strangers alike leaving flowers and notes. Detectives, meanwhile, were battling the frustration of red herrings. The burned car at 29th and Lisbon was a message of defiance. By choosing such a public location to torch the vehicle, the perpetrator was showing a complete lack of fear. The fire had been so intense that much of the interior was vaporized, leaving the forensic teams to sift through ash and slag in hopes of finding a single, unburned clue. The search was now a psychological puzzle. Investigators were trying to get inside the mind of a man who could sit through a dinner and then, hours later, stand on a beach in the dead of night, disposing of a human life. The focus shifted entirely to Maxwell Anderson, a man who was about to find out that the city he tried to hide his crimes in was much smaller than he thought. The investigation into Maxwell Anderson was not a sprint. It was a grueling, methodical excavation of a man's life. Detectives in Milwaukee, already reeling from the discovery of the limb at Warnemont Park, began to pull at the digital threads that connected Sade Robinson to her killer. The first breakthrough came from the very place where the date had supposedly flourished, the surveillance cameras at Duke's On Water. The footage was grainier than a celluloid dream, but it was definitive. It showed Maxwell Anderson sitting in a booth with Sade. It showed them leaving together. It showed Sade stepping into his car, and her own Honda Civic left behind like a discarded shell in the downtown shadows. The red herrings initially plagued the precinct. Was it a carjacking gone wrong? Had Sade been intercepted by someone else after she left the bar? The burning of her car on the north side seemed like a tactic to throw the scent toward the city's more volatile neighborhoods. But the digital footprint told a different story. Investigators obtained a warrant for Maxwell's phone records and the Life 360 data from Sade's device. The results were a map of a nightmare. On the night of April 1st, both phones pinged together at Maxwell's residence on North 33rd Street. Then, in the early hours of April 2nd, Maxwell's phone traveled to Warnemont Park, the exact location where the leg was found. The digital trail didn't just suggest his presence, It tracked his every movement as he played the role of a modern-day Sharon, moving between the site of the murder and the desolate sites of disposal. On April 4th, 2024, the investigation moved from the digital to the visceral. A swarm of forensic technicians, clad in white Tyvek suits that stood out against the gray industrial landscape of the West Side, descended upon the house on North 33rd Street. The air inside the residence was thick with the scent of pine cleaner and stale air, a desperate olfactory attempt to mask what had occurred. In the basement, the true nature of Maxwell Anderson's intent was laid bare. Beneath the flickering glow of overhead shop lights, the concrete floor whispered of violence. Using luminol, a chemical that causes blood to glow a ghostly blue under ultraviolet light, technicians revealed a constellation of splatters across the walls and the floor. It was a map of a struggle, a record of the final moments of a woman who had simply wanted a dinner out. They found more than just pings and splatters. In the basement, investigators discovered a blood-soaked rug and evidence of a hasty, incomplete cleanup. The DNA profile from the blood in the basement matched the DNA from the severed limb found on the beach. It was a 1 in a billion match. The realization that Sade Robinson had been dismantled in this subterranean space turned the stomachs of even the most hardened veterans on the force. Maxwell Anderson hadn't just killed her, he had used his father's house as a workshop for a horrific experiment in disposal. The arrest of Maxwell Anderson was as unremarkable as his crime was spectacular. On April 4th, police conducted a traffic stop on a vehicle he was driving. He didn't run, he didn't scream. He sat in the cruiser with a chilling, vacant expression that would become his hallmark in the months to follow. Inside his car, detectives found more than just a suspect. They found the remnants of his frantic attempts to hide the truth. They found a container of accelerant, likely the same kind used to torch Sade's Honda Civic. They found gloves. They found a man who believed he was smarter than the system Sade had dedicated her life to studying. He told the investigators he had no idea where the girl had gone after they parted ways, but the evidence in his backseat suggested a far more permanent separation. But the horror wasn't over. As the investigation deepened, more parts of Sade Robinson began to appear, surfacing like fragments of a broken promise. An arm was found in a separate part of the city. More remains were discovered in the dense undergrowth near the lake. The methodology was clear. Maxwell was trying to make it impossible for a complete body to ever be recovered. He was gambling on the idea that without a whole victim, the case against him would crumble. He underestimated the power of forensic science and the tenacity of the Milwaukee community. The why began to emerge as detectives looked into Maxwell's past. They spoke to ex-girlfriends who recounted a man who could turn from a charming companion to a violent controller in the blink of an eye. They found a history of domestic battery, documented instances where he had physically assaulted women who dared to assert their independence. To Maxwell, Sade wasn't a student or a daughter. She was a challenge to his perceived authority. The date night killer wasn't a new creation. He was the final, inevitable evolution of a man who had spent his life practicing for this very moment. The investigation also touched on the social echo of the crime. In the bars where Maxwell had worked, the regulars were stunned. They remembered him as the guy who made a decent old-fashioned, the guy who was a bit intense, but seemingly harmless. The fear that swept through the city's dating scene was palpable. Every ping on a dating app now felt like a potential threat. The investigation had moved beyond the walls of the basement and the shores of the lake. It had become a cultural reckoning for a city that suddenly felt much less safe. By the time the formal charges were being prepared, the evidence was an alpine peak of data and DNA. They had the surveillance footage, the phone pings, the blood in the basement, the accelerant in the car, and the biological matches for every limb recovered. Maxwell Anderson sat in his cell, his silence a shield he believed would protect him, but the evidence was speaking for Sade Robinson. It was telling the story of a 19-year-old who had walked into a trap and a man who had methodically tried to erase her existence. The investigation was over, but the trial and the search for the rest of Sade was just beginning. The legal reckoning for Maxwell Anderson unfolded in a Milwaukee courtroom where the staggering weight of forensic evidence resulted in a historic $5 million bond. He stood charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and arson, a trifecta of crimes that painted him as a ghost of the city's darkest impulses. Throughout the preliminary hearings and the trial, Anderson maintained a posture of chilling indifference, his expression remaining a blank canvas even as the prosecution displayed the horrific evidence recovered from his North 33rd Street basement. He rarely looked toward the gallery, where Sade's family sat in a unified front of grief and resilience. The prosecution's case was a surgical reconstruction of the night of April 1st, using digital pings and biological matches to close every possible door of escape. By the time the verdict was delivered in late 2025, the date night killer was no longer a phantom of the dating apps, but a convicted man facing the rest of his natural life behind bars. The trial served as a final public declaration that while Maxwell had tried to dismantle Sade's body, he could never dismantle her name or her legacy. The memory of the 19-year-old remains a rallying cry for safety in a digital age that often masks true intentions. Her graduation gown, once a symbol of a beginning, now serves as a persistent reminder of a life stolen by a man who perfected the art of deception. The shoreline of Lake Michigan has returned to its quiet rhythm, but Milwaukee is forever changed. More vigilant, more protective of its daughters. Justice was served in a courtroom, but for a mother facing an empty chair, the search for peace remains as vast as the lake itself. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Las Vegas is a city of secrets, but Jeff German spent 40 years dragging them into the light. He was Nevada's most feared investigative reporter, a man who survived threats from the mob and corrupt officials alike. But in 2022, he met a killer who didn't belong in the underworld. It was a high-ranking politician he had recently exposed. As he was being stabbed, the 69-year-old fought back, clawing the murderer's DNA into his fingernails. The final silent testimony of a man who refused to let the truth die with him. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the collision that left a neighborhood stained in blood, one must first look at the two men who occupied completely different corners of the Nevada desert. In the red-tinted light of a Las Vegas sunrise, the city reveals its true self. Not the neon glitter of the Strip, but a vast, sprawling machine fueled by power, money, and secrets. Jeff German was the man who kept the receipts. At 69 years old, he was a relic of a dying era of journalism, a time when reporters wore out shoe leather instead of just scrolling through social media. He had spent 40 years in the trenches, moving from the Las Vegas Sun to the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and in that time, he had become the city's unofficial historian of corruption. German was a man of precision and silence. He lived alone in an upscale, quiet pocket of Summerlin, a suburb that felt a world away from the chaos of the casinos. His colleagues described him as a lone wolf, a bachelor whose primary relationship was with the truth. He didn't have a family to go home to. He had stacks of court records, anonymous tips, and a burner phone that never stayed silent for long. In the 1980s and 90s, he had gone toe-to-toe with the most dangerous mobsters in the state, exposing the hole-in-the-wall gang and the brutal underbelly of the casino industry. He had been threatened, followed, and intimidated, yet he remained the conscience of Las Vegas. He was a tall, lean figure who favored tailored suits and a stoic expression, moving through the halls of justice with the confidence of a man who knew where all the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. Then there was Robert Telles. If Jeff German was the shadow, Telles was the man desperately trying to stand in the sun. Born in 1976, Telles represented the new Nevada. He was a graduate of the UNLV Boyd School of Law, a practicing attorney who saw politics as his ultimate calling. In 2018, riding a wave of progressive reform, he was elected as the Clark County Public Administrator. It was a role that most voters barely understood, yet it carried immense, quiet power. His office was responsible for overseeing the estates of those who died without a will or without family, handling the homes, the jewelry, and the life savings of the departed. On the surface, Tellez was the picture of suburban success. He had a wife, children, and a comfortable home with a swimming pool. He was active on social media, often posting about his dedication to transparency and fairness. He viewed himself as a rising star in the Democratic Party, a man destined for higher office, perhaps a judgeship or a seat in the legislature. He cultivated an image of a hardworking, empathetic public servant who was cleaning up an old, dusty corner of the government. But behind the polished LinkedIn profile and the campaign smiles, a different reality was festering inside the public administrator's office. By early 2022, the atmosphere under Tellez's leadership had turned radioactive. Longtime employees, some of whom had served the county for decades, felt as though they were living in a panopticon. They claimed Tellez was not a reformer, but a micromanager with a hair-trigger temper, a man who played favorites and fostered a hostile work environment. They spoke of secret allegiances and a professional environment that had devolved into something resembling a high school clique, fueled by rumors of an inappropriate relationship between Tellez and a subordinate. These employees knew that in Las Vegas, if you wanted something exposed, there was only one name you called. They reached out to Jeff German. When German began his investigation, he wasn't looking for a murder story. He was looking for a story about the misuse of power. He spent months meeting with whistleblowers in dark corners of parking garages and coffee shops, listening to their accounts of a boss who had become a tyrant. For German, this was a standard assignment, another mid-level politician with an ego problem. For Tellez, however, the inquiry was an existential threat to a man who had built his entire identity on the perception of being a good guy. The prospect of a Jeff German expose was equivalent to a death sentence for his career. As German began filing public records requests and asking uncomfortable questions, the two men's lives began to orbit one another in a dangerous dance. German was methodical, cold, and focused on the facts. Tellez was becoming increasingly erratic, lashing out at his staff and growing obsessed with the reporter who was digging into his life. He didn't understand that German couldn't be bought or bullied. He was a man who had stared down the mob. A local politician didn't scare him. But Tellez wasn't just a politician, he was a man who felt the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. And in the dry, oppressive heat of a Nevada summer, that kind of desperation can quickly turn into something much darker. The first deep cracks in Robert Tellez's carefully curated reality didn't appear in a courtroom or a jail cell, but on the front page of the Las Vegas Review-Journal in May 2022. For months, the atmosphere inside the Clark County Public Administrator's office had been reaching a boiling point, a quiet, desperate kind of heat that only those trapped within the four walls of the government building could truly feel. Behind the heavy doors, employees were no longer focusing on the estates of the deceased. They were focused on surviving their boss. The catalyst for the explosion was a group of whistleblowers, long-term public servants like Rita Reed, who had finally reached their breaking point. They described an office culture that had devolved into a warring camp, a landscape of us versus them. They alleged that Tellez had transformed a once efficient department into a hotbed of favoritism and bullying. The complaints weren't just about harsh words, they were about a systematic dismantling of professional dignity. Employees claimed Tellez would single out those who didn't show absolute, unquestioning loyalty, subjecting them to public reprimands and a constant, suffocating level of surveillance. Jeff German was the man who caught their echoes. When he began his investigation, he was handed a treasure trove of internal grievances and secret recordings. These weren't just disgruntled rants. They were the sounds of a workplace in total collapse. The whistleblowers described Tellez as being obsessed with factions, rewarding a small circle of inner sanctum staffers while ostracizing the rest. But the most explosive element of the investigation involved a woman named Roberta Lee Kennett, a subordinate whom Tellez allegedly favored to a degree that crossed professional boundaries. The rumors of an inappropriate relationship were a wildfire in the office, but German needed more than whispers. He needed proof. That proof came in the form of a grainy, surreptitiously filmed video taken in a parking garage. The footage showed Tellez and Lee Kennett in the backseat of a car, a visual confirmation of the office gossip that Tellez had vehemently denied. For German, it was a crucial piece of the puzzle. evidence of a leader whose personal life was bleeding into his professional duties, compromising the integrity of his office. When German's first article hit the stands, the impact was immediate and devastating. It painted Telles not as the progressive reformer he claimed to be, but as a petulant, insecure micromanager who was unfit for leadership. Telles' response was a masterclass in psychological projection. He didn't issue a formal, measured rebuttal. Instead, he took to social media, launching a digital crusade against the man who had exposed him. He portrayed himself as a victim of a hit piece, claiming that German was a bully who was obsessed with his downfall. The timing couldn't have been worse for the politician. The primary election for his seat was just weeks away. In the high-stakes world of Nevada politics, a Jeff German expose is often a career ender, and Telles was about to learn that the hard way. Despite his frantic attempts to discredit the reporting, the voters had seen enough. In the June 2022 primary, Telles didn't just lose, he was humiliated, finishing a distant third. In a single evening, his political trajectory, the judicial aspirations, the dreams of higher office, was effectively vaporized. But Telles refused to go quietly into the night. His obsession with German only intensified as he entered the lame duck period of his term. He spent his days stewing in the bitterness of his defeat, convinced that German and the old guard of the office had conspired to ruin him. His Twitter feed became a bizarre stream of consciousness. A series of attacks directed at German, calling him a hatchet man and mocking the reporter's age. He even posted screenshots of German's emails, trying to prove a bias that didn't exist. German, for his part, was unmoved. To him, Telles was just another subject who didn't like the mirror being held up to them. He ignored the online taunts and kept working. He was already deep into a follow-up story. A second article that would detail even more allegations of misconduct and the continued chaos within the office after the election. He filed a fresh round of public records requests, seeking internal communications and emails that Telles was desperate to keep hidden. For Telles, this was the ultimate provocation. He was a man who had already lost his status, his future, and his pride. The thought of a second article, a final crushing blow from the man he hated most, seemed to be the tipping point. The digital war was no longer enough to satisfy his resentment. As the desert heat intensified in late August, Telles' focus shifted from defending his reputation to something far more permanent. He began to study the reporter's habits, his home, and his quiet suburban street, preparing for a confrontation that would transition from the page to the pavement. Friday, September 2nd, 2022. The Las Vegas Valley is already beginning to bake under a relentless sun by mid-morning. In the Summerlin neighborhood, the air is thick with the scent of parched earth and the low-frequency hum of hundreds of industrial-strength air conditioning units struggling against the desert. This is a community of high-walled gardens and manicured xeriscaping, a place designed for privacy, for quiet, and for the kind of anonymity that money buys. At 10:30 a.m., the temperature is already climbing toward 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Jeff German is at home. For a man who spent his life chasing the loudest stories in Nevada, his personal routine is remarkably hushed. He is 69 years old, lean and physically active, but he moves with the unhurried grace of a man who knows exactly how much time he has left in his day. He has no reason to be on guard. His house, a modest but elegant property on Bronze Pebble Terrace, is his sanctuary. He is likely thinking about his next move in the Telles investigation, perhaps mentally drafting the opening paragraph of the follow-up article that would finally close the chapter on the public administrator's career. Outside, the silence of the cul-de-sac is broken by the low rumble of a vehicle, a maroon GMC Yukon, an older model, slightly weathered by the Nevada grit, cruises slowly past the house. It doesn't belong here. It circles, its dark-tinted windows acting as a two-way mirror between a predator and his prey. The driver is patient. He has been watching. He knows the rhythms of this street. A figure emerges from the vehicle, parked a short distance away. At first glance, he looks like any other municipal worker or landscaper common to the suburbs. He wears a wide-brimmed straw hat, the kind worn by those who spend 12 hours a day under the sun, and a neon orange high-visibility reflective vest. Underneath, Long sleeves cover his arms despite the rising heat. He carries a bag. To a casual observer, he is invisible, a background character in the suburban landscape. But he isn't here to work on the roads. The man in the straw hat approaches the side of German's house. He moves with a purpose that is both hurried and strangely clinical. He slips into the shadows of the side yard, near a gate that leads to the rear of the property. He waits. The desert heat is a weight, pressing down on the orange fabric of his vest, but he doesn't move. He is a neon silhouette standing in a blind spot. Inside, something draws Jeff German toward the side of his home. Perhaps he hears a noise, a gate latch clicking, a footfall on the gravel, or perhaps he is simply stepping out to check a utility box. He opens the door and steps into the narrow passage between his house and the neighboring wall. The transition from the cool, filtered air of the interior to the blinding glare of the morning is instantaneous. The attack is not a cinematic struggle. It is a frantic, brutal collision. The man in the straw hat lunges. There is no warning, no exchange of words, just the sudden, violent presence of another body in a space that should be private. A blade glints in the harsh light, a sharp, functional tool meant for a singular purpose. Jeff German, a man of nearly 70, finds himself fighting for his life in a space less than 6 feet wide. The pacing of the world shifts. The hum of the AC units disappears, replaced by the sound of scuffling shoes on desert rock and the ragged, desperate gasps of a man realized his mortality. German is thin, but he is not a victim who goes quietly. He has spent 4 decades fighting with words, and in his final moments, he fights with everything else. He reaches out, his hands clawing at the orange vest, at the long sleeves, seeking a grip, seeking to push back the weight of the man pressing him into the earth. He is stabbed multiple times. The intruder is relentless, striking with a focused, manic energy. The blade finds its mark again and again, in the torso, in the neck. German falls, the heat of the pavement rising to meet the heat of the blood soaking into his shirt. But even as his strength begins to hemorrhage away, his instincts as a chronicler of truth remain. As the attacker leans in, German's hands reach up, his fingernails digging into the skin of his killer. It is a microscopic act of defiance. He isn't just fighting to live, he is collecting evidence. He is ensuring that even if he cannot speak, his body will carry the name of his murderer into the laboratory. The man in the straw hat stands up. He is breathing hard. He looks down at the crumpled figure of the reporter, the man who had turned his life into a series of public records. The neighborhood remains silent. No one has heard the struggle. No one has seen the orange vest disappear into the side yard. The killer turns and walks back toward the street, his gait heavy, his head down under the shade of the straw brim. He returns to the maroon Yukon. The engine turns over with a familiar metallic growl. He pulls away from the curb, merging into the light Friday traffic of Summerlin, disappearing into the sea of SUVs and desert dust. Back on Bronze Pebble Terrace, the sun continues its ascent. The shadows in the side yard shorten. Jeff German lies still, his eyes fixed on a blue Nevada sky he will never write about again. He is alone. The blood on the gravel is already beginning to darken, drying quickly in the 100-degree heat. To the neighbors passing by, the house looks exactly as it did an hour ago, peaceful, prosperous, and secure. They don't know that the conscience of Las Vegas has been silenced. They don't know that for the first time in 40 years, Jeff German has become the story he was never supposed to tell. The only witness is the microscopic traces of skin and hair trapped beneath the reporter's fingernails, the final silent testimony of a man who refused to let a politician have the last word. Saturday morning in the Las Vegas Valley usually carries the heavy, sluggish hangover of a Friday night's excess, but on Bronze Pebble Terrace, the atmosphere was unnervingly frozen. Jeff German was a man of clockwork precision. His absence was the first alarm that something had gone fundamentally wrong. He didn't miss meetings. He didn't ignore his phone. He was a man who lived by the deadline, and when the sun began its climb toward noon on September 3rd, 2022, his silence felt like a physical weight in the newsroom of the Las Vegas Review-Journal. It was roughly 10:30 a.m. when the safety of the Summerlin suburbs was finally stripped away. A neighbor, moving through the routine of a quiet weekend morning, glanced toward the side of German's home, a narrow gravel-lined walkway that served as a buffer between the residence and the heat-baked wall of the adjacent property. There, in the shadow of the house, they saw something that defied the manicured logic of the neighborhood. The body lay crumpled in the walkway. At first glance, the neighbor hoped it was a medical emergency, perhaps a fall or a sudden heart attack brought on by the punishing desert heat. But as they drew closer, the hope evaporated into a cold, visceral reality. There was blood. Far too much blood for an accident. It was pooled in the desert rock, stained into the beige stucco of the house, and darkened by nearly 24 hours of exposure. Jeff German was cold, his body already rigid with the finality of a life taken the day before. When the first 911 call crackled over the police scanners, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department didn't yet realize they were standing at the epicenter of a national firestorm. The responding officers found a scene that was as brutal as it was targeted. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Jeff's wallet was still in his pocket, his keys were nearby, and the interior of the house remained undisturbed, a silent tomb of investigative notes and tailored suits. This was an assassination, an execution carried out in the most personal of ways. In the newsroom of the Review-Journal, the silence that followed the confirmation was deafening. Reporters are conditioned to handle death. They spend their careers writing about tragedy in the third person, distanced by the cold mechanics of prose. But when Jeff German's name scrolled across the police wire as a homicide victim, the collective breath of Nevada's media was held. Executive editor Glenn Cook would later describe the sensation as a physical blow to the heart of the institution. Jeff wasn't just a colleague, he was the dean. He was the man who had seen the mob, the corrupt, and the killers come and go. And now, he was the one being outlined in white chalk on a suburban driveway. The community echo was a volatile mixture of grief and a very specific historical kind of terror. In a city like Las Vegas, built on the foundations of organized crime and disappeared witnesses, the murder of a reporter carried a heavy, ominous resonance. It felt like a regression, a violent jump back to the 1970s when the mob used car bombs to silence the press. The rumors began to move like wildfire through the casinos, the law firms, and the corridors of the Clark County Government Center. Everyone knew Jeff's list of enemies was longer than the Strip. He had spent 40 years ensuring that the powerful never felt entirely comfortable. But as the initial shock subsided, the focus of both the newsroom and the homicide detectives began to narrow with surgical precision. They looked at his recent work. They looked at the man he had dismantled in the weeks prior. They looked at Robert Tels, the public administrator who had spent the last 3 months lashing out on social media like a cornered animal, his vitriol becoming increasingly erratic as his political career turned to ash. The local atmosphere changed overnight. Journalism in Nevada had always been a contact sport, but now it felt like a war zone. Reporters began checking their rearview mirrors on the drive home. They looked twice at the SUVs idling on their streets. The fear wasn't just about Jeff's death. It was about the brazen, untouchable nature of the act. The killer hadn't waited for a dark alley or a midnight encounter. He had done it in broad daylight, in a quiet neighborhood during the busiest hours of a Friday morning. The detectives processed the scene with a grim, clinical meticulousness. They noted the lack of forced entry and the specific positioning of the body. Jeff had been surprised, perhaps lured into the walkway by someone he thought he recognized or someone who looked like they belonged. The forensic teams began the painstaking process of collecting what the desert hadn't already destroyed. They looked for shell casings, but found none. This was a blade crime. It was intimate, quiet, and required a terrifying level of resolve. As the sun set on that first day of the investigation, Jeff German's desk at the office remained exactly as he had left it on Thursday evening. There were piles of public records, a half-empty coffee cup, and a stack of notes for a follow-up story on Robert Tels that he would never get to finish. It was a visual representation of a life interrupted mid-sentence. The why was the only question that mattered now. Was it a cold case from the 90s seeking revenge? Or was it the man who had been tweeting his hatred for German just hours before the body was discovered? The suspicion toward Tels wasn't just a hunch, it was a gravity that everyone in the city felt pulling them toward a single maroon vehicle that had been caught on a neighbor's Ring camera, a vehicle that would lead the police directly to the doorstep of a public official who thought he was smarter than the man who caught the truth. The trail that led to Robert Tels was digital before it was physical. While Jeff German's body was being processed by the coroner, a different kind of forensic work was happening on the quiet streets of Summerlin. Detectives didn't have to look far for a motive, but they needed a machine, a specific maroon-colored machine. They began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, and asking for access to the one thing that has replaced the eyewitness in modern America, the Ring doorbell camera. The footage was a jigsaw puzzle of grainy, wide-angle clips. Piece by piece, the detectives reconstructed the movements of a vehicle that had no business in the cul-de-sac. It was a maroon GMC Yukon XL, an older, boxy SUV that stood out against the late-model European cars and electric vehicles common to the area. On the morning of the murder, the vehicle was seen circling the block, lingering near German's home, and finally pulling away just minutes after the estimated time of the attack. The investigation hit a surge of adrenaline when the detectives cross-referenced the vehicle with the public records Jeff German had died for. They discovered that Robert Tels, the very man German had spent months exposing, drove a vehicle that was a near-identical match to the one on the surveillance tapes. The gravity of the case shifted instantly. This wasn't just a lead, it was a collision course. But the police weren't the only ones hunting. In an extraordinary display of professional loyalty and investigative grit, Jeff German's colleagues at the Las Vegas Review-Journal began their own hunt. They weren't just mourning, they were reporting. On Tuesday, September 6th, news crews from the paper staked out Tella's home. They watched as a man who had spent the last week tweeting about his vindication, now huddled inside behind drawn blinds. Then they saw it. Parked in the driveway was the maroon Yukon. The reporters photographed the vehicle and sent the images to the police, effectively forcing the hand of law enforcement through the power of the press. On the morning of Wednesday, September 7th, the silence of Tell's suburban neighborhood was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots and the barking of commands through megaphones. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived with a search warrant that would tear the politician's life open. They didn't just want the car, they wanted the work clothes seen on the man in the straw hat. The search inside the Tellys' residence was a descent into the desperate mind of a man trying to outrun a deadline. In the garage, detectives found the maroon Yukon, but it was the items hidden inside the house that provided the most visceral connection to the crime. They found a pair of sneakers, expensive, high-end shoes that had been meticulously washed, but the killer had been hurried. In the deep recesses of the seams and the underside of the tongue, forensic technicians found what they were looking for: microscopic traces of human blood. Then came the discovery of the costume. Inside the home, detectives found a wide-brimmed straw hat and a neon orange reflective vest, the exact items worn by the killer to blend into the suburban landscape. But Tellus had tried to destroy them. The hat had been cut into tiny, irregular pieces, a frantic attempt to render the evidence unrecognizable. The vest, too, had been shredded. It was a pathetic, mechanical attempt at a cover-up, the work of a man who understood the law but didn't understand the relentless nature of forensic science. While the physical evidence was being bagged and tagged, the most damning piece of the puzzle was being solved in a sterile lab across the city. The skin cells and DNA that Jeff German had clawed into his fingernails during his final struggle were compared against a sample taken from Tellus. The result was a mathematical certainty. The DNA found on the dead reporter belonged to the public administrator. The investigation reached its climax as Tels realized the walls had finally closed in. As SWAT teams surrounded the house for a second time that evening to execute the arrest warrant, Tels retreated into his bathroom. He didn't come out. The standoff lasted for hours. A high-stakes drama played out in front of news cameras and neighbors. When the police finally breached the door, they found a man who had tried to take the easy way out. Tels had inflicted self-harm in a desperate, failed attempt to avoid the handcuffs. He was wheeled out of his home on a gurney, his face pale and obscured by an oxygen mask, surrounded by the very fake news reporters he had spent months disparaging. He was no longer a rising political star or a reformist official. He was a suspect in a cold-blooded assassination, a man who had been caught by the very DNA of the man he tried to silence. The trail of the maroon Yukon had ended at the Clark County Detention Center. The investigation had moved with a speed that was rare in homicide cases, fueled by the collective outrage of a city and the tireless work of a newsroom that refused to let their colleague become just another unsolved mystery in the desert. Robert Tells had thought he could kill the messenger to stop the message, but as he was led into a jail cell, the irony of his situation was absolute. By killing Jeff German, he had ensured that his own name would be written in the one place he feared most, the permanent, unerasable record of the truth. The trial of Robert Tells, which began in August 2024, was a spectacle of the surreal, a final desperate attempt to overwrite reality. Standing before the jury, the former official didn't just maintain his innocence. He spun a labyrinthine conspiracy theory that felt like the plot of a low-budget thriller. He testified for hours, claiming he had been framed by a shadowy alliance of local police, corporate real estate interests, and the old guard from his own office, all supposedly in retaliation for his reformist agenda. He attempted to explain away the DNA under German's fingernails and the blood-soaked shoes in his closet as elaborate plants left by professional saboteurs. But the jury saw through the fiction. The physical evidence was a mountain that his words could not climb. After nearly 12 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. As he was led away in shackles, the man who tried to control every narrative found himself silenced by the very system he once vowed to lead. Jeff German's desk is finally clear, but the silence in the newsroom is far from empty. He didn't just report on the rot in Clark County. He became the final, irrefutable piece of evidence needed to cut it out. In a town where neon lights usually blind the public to the truth, German proved that integrity has a heartbeat, one that even a killer's blade couldn't stop. Robert Tells wanted to bury his scandals. Instead, he buried himself. The truth didn't die on that Summerlin driveway. It just found a new way to be heard. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. The garage door in Tallahassee hummed, a sound as routine as the morning commute. But when two bullets shattered the stillness of Trescott Drive in 2014, they didn't just end the life of a brilliant law professor. They ignited a decade-long pursuit of a family that believed they were above the law. This wasn't a street crime. It was a clinical, paid execution. Fast forward to 2023. A grandmother stands at a boarding gate with a one-way ticket to Vietnam, only to be met by handcuffs instead of a flight to freedom. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand why a world-class academic would be targeted for a hit, you have to understand the two very different worlds that collided when Dan Markle met Wendy Adelson. Dan was an intellectual titan, a Toronto-born, Harvard-educated legal scholar who had transformed Florida State University's law school into a hub for cutting-edge criminal theory. He was a man of meticulous logic, a frequent traveler on the international lecture circuit, and the founder of an influential legal blog. In the halls of FSU, he was known as a brilliant, if sometimes rigid professor, who demanded excellence from everyone around him. He didn't just study the law, he lived it through a lens of strict morality and academic rigor. On the other side of the Florida Peninsula, 350 miles south of Tallahassee, sat the Adelson Kingdom. Based in Coral Springs, the Adelson family was the embodiment of South Florida's elite professional class. Harvey Adelson, the patriarch, was a celebrated dentist who had spent decades building the Adelson Institute into a multi-million-dollar empire of cosmetic and implant dentistry. His practice was a palace of polished marble and high-end aesthetics, catering to a clientele that expected perfection. But the true center of gravity in the family was Donna Adelson. Donna wasn't just a matriarch. She was the family's chief strategist and emotional architect. She operated with a fierce, almost suffocating loyalty to her children, viewing the world through a binary lens. You were either part of the Adelson inner circle, or you were an obstacle. Her life was a meticulously curated series of country club lunches, high-end real estate, and a constant, vibrating need to keep her children physically and emotionally close. Then there was Charlie Adelson, the middle child and the family's resident enforcer. A successful periodontist by trade, Charlie lived a life that felt like a screenplay. He was a gym-obsessed playboy who drove Ferraris, frequented high-stakes poker games, and kept a foot in two worlds: the sterile precision of his surgical suite and the grittier underbelly of Miami's social scene. He was deeply bonded to his mother, sharing a shorthand of secrets and a shared disdain for anything or anyone that threatened the family's peace. Wendy Adelson was the princess of this dynasty. She was bright, blonde, and possessed a law degree of her own, but she lived under the immense shadow of her mother's expectations. When she and Dan married in 2006, it initially looked like the ultimate power couple, the brilliant scholar and the beautiful attorney. But the geography was the first crack in the foundation. Dan was tenured at FSU in Tallahassee, a town defined by rolling hills, Spanish moss, and a slower academic pace. To the Adelsons, Tallahassee was a backwater, a 7-hour trek from the civilization of South Florida. Donna viewed her daughter's life in the state capital as a form of exile. The tension grew as Dan and Wendy had two sons, grandsons, who became the absolute obsession of Donna Adelson. She didn't just want to visit them, she wanted to own their time. She frequently sent emails to Wendy, filled with thinly veiled contempt for Dan's control and his insistence on staying in North Florida for his career. As the boys grew, the friction between Dan's rigid intellectual world and the Adelsons' wealthy South Florida bubble reached a boiling point. Dan was a man who believed in rules and stability. Donna was a woman who believed that wealth and family loyalty should be able to bend any rule. In Donna's mind, Dan Markell wasn't just a son-in-law who lived too far away. He was an interloper who was keeping her daughter and grandsons hostage in a town she despised. The sunburn of Tallahassee was becoming an unbearable blister for the Adelsons, and the psychological stage was set for a solution that didn't involve a courtroom. The union of Dan Markell and Wendy Adelson didn't begin with a chance encounter in a coffee shop or a meeting in a law library. It began with the digital precision of a dating site. In 2004, the two found each other on JDate, a platform that promised a match of shared heritage and high-level ambition. To their respective families, it felt like the stars had aligned. Dan was the brilliant scholar with a global reputation. Wendy was the beautiful, accomplished daughter of a South Florida powerhouse. On paper, they were a match of equals, two high-functioning legal minds ready to build a legacy. Their 2006 wedding in Boca Raton was an exercise in Adelson opulence. It was a grand, multi-day affair where the family's wealth was on full display, a celebration that signaled the merging of an intellectual dynasty with a financial one. But even amid the champagne toasts and the intricate floral arrangements, the seeds of the coming tragedy were already being sown. The Adelsons were a tight-knit, almost insular unit, and Dan Markell was a man who belonged to no one but his own principles. The couple settled in Tallahassee, where Dan had secured a prestigious tenure-track position at Florida State University. Wendy joined him, eventually finding her own place within the university's clinical law program. For a few years, they played the part of the successful academic couple. They bought a home on Trescott Drive, a quiet, tree-lined street that felt like the epitome of suburban safety. Then came the children. Two sons were born in quick succession, boys who were the pride of Dan Markell's life and the absolute obsession of the Adelson family back in Coral Springs. But as the children grew, the geographical distance between Tallahassee and Miami began to feel like a chasm. Wendy started to feel the sunburn, a term she later used in a fictionalized novel to describe the suffocating, small-town atmosphere of Tallahassee. She missed the high-gloss lifestyle of South Florida, the proximity to her mother, the feeling of being at the center of the world rather than in a sleepy state capital. Donna Adelson didn't help matters. She maintained a constant digital tether to her daughter, sending a relentless stream of emails that analyzed every aspect of Wendy's life and marriage. Donna's messages were often scathing. She spoke of Dan in terms usually reserved for a political enemy, calling him vile, the adversary, and a man who was actively trying to diminish Wendy's light. She encouraged her daughter to push back, to stand up to Dan's control. In Donna's worldview, Dan's insistence on a stable home life in Tallahassee wasn't a commitment to his career or his children. It was a personal affront to the Adelson family's right to have their daughter close. By 2012, the relationship had decayed into a toxic standoff. Dan, ever the man of routine and order, believed they could work through their issues. Wendy, however, was already planning her exit, a plan that was executed with the clinical coldness of a military operation. In September 2012, while Dan was away on a short business trip, Wendy made her move. When Dan returned to the house on Trescott Drive, he didn't find a welcoming home. He found a shell. Wendy had moved out, taking the children, half the furniture, and even the electronics. The house was stripped, the silence echoing against the bare walls. He was served with divorce papers almost immediately. It was a surprise divorce, a calculated strike designed to leave him disoriented and powerless. But Wendy had underestimated Dan's resolve. He wasn't a man who would simply walk away from his children or his home. The legal war that followed was scorched earth. The central point of contention was relocation. Wendy filed a motion to move the children to South Florida, arguing that she needed the support system of her family. Dan fought it with every ounce of his legal brilliance. He argued that the boys needed their father, that their life was in Tallahassee. The judge agreed with Dan. The motion to relocate was denied. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. Wendy was legally tethered to a town she hated, living in close proximity to a man she now viewed with pure vitriol. To Donna Adelson, this was a catastrophe. Her daughter and grandsons were trapped by a man who refused to yield. The family discussed options that felt like something out of a dark satire. They talked about offering Dan a bribe, $1 million to simply go away and let Wendy move south. They even discussed a split custody arrangement that would involve the boys living in different cities. Dan rejected every overture. He wanted to be a father, not a paid-off spectator. The tension reached a fever pitch in the months leading up to July 2014. Dan had recently filed a motion to compel and a motion to limit Donna Adelson's contact with the children. He had become aware that Donna was speaking disparagingly about him to the boys, calling him stupid and a bad man. Dan sought a court order that would require Donna's visits to be supervised, a move that would have been the ultimate humiliation for the Adelson matriarch. To Donna, this wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a declaration of war against her role as a grandmother. She spoke to her son, Charlie, about the problem of Dan Markell. The problem was a man who stood in the way of the Adelson family's total control. He was a man who used the law to protect his rights. And in the minds of the Adelsons, he was a man who had finally run out of time. The legal motions were set for a hearing, but Dan Markell would never make it to the courtroom. The solution would not be found in a judge's ruling, but in the dark connections of Charlie Adelson's Miami social circle. The air in Tallahassee on the morning of July 18, 2014, was a heavy, suffocating blanket of North Florida humidity. It was a Friday, the kind of day where the cadence of life usually slows down as the weekend approached. For Dan Markell, life was a series of scheduled blocks, a testament to his disciplined, academic mind. He was a creature of habit. He started his morning at Premier Health and Fitness, pushing through a workout that served as his mental reset before a day of research and child rearing. He was a man who appreciated the structure of his life, unaware that the structure was being dismantled from the outside. But while Dan was lifting weights, two men were vibrating with a very different kind of energy. Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera had been in town for days, lurking in a rented metallic green Toyota Prius, a vehicle so inconspicuous it was almost invisible in the leafy suburbs of the capital. They were a long way from home. They had driven hundreds of miles from the neon-soaked streets of Miami, sent on a mission that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with a family's desperate solution. They had stayed at a cheap motel, eating fast food and waiting for the right window of time. They weren't professionals in the cinematic sense. They were hired muscle, blunt instruments, fueled by the promise of a payday that Charlie Adelson had allegedly facilitated through a middlewoman. They had done their homework. Earlier that morning, they were captured on city bus cameras and surveillance feeds, trailing Dan's silver Honda Odyssey with predatory patience. They watched him at the gym. They waited while he went about the most mundane tasks of fatherhood. At approximately 8:50 a.m., Dan finished his workout. He looked like any other suburban father, dressed in gym clothes, his mind likely drifting toward his upcoming legal projects. He picked up his 2 young sons from their home and drove them to their preschool, the Creative Child Learning Center. He walked them in, hugged them goodbye, and left. It was the last time they would feel the warmth of their father's embrace. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the green Prius was there, a silent shadow tucked into the morning traffic. They followed him to a nearby center where he dropped off some items, and then they trailed him as he made the short drive back to his home on Trescott Drive. The street was quiet. Neighbors were at work. The moss-draped oaks stood still in the heat. Dan pulled into his driveway. He pressed the button for the garage door. As the heavy door groaned upward, he stayed on his mobile phone, talking to a school official about his children's enrollment for the upcoming term. He was preoccupied. He was safe. He was home. The Prius pulled in right behind him, a jarring intrusion into the sanctuary of his garage. Luis Rivera watched from the car. Sigfredo Garcia stepped out. The window of the Honda Odyssey was up. Dan was still talking on the phone, his voice steady, discussing the future of his boys. He likely didn't even have time to register the face of the man standing by his driver's side door. There was no conversation, no warning, just the mechanical finality of a firearm. Garcia fired. The first bullet shattered the glass. It struck Dan in the head. He fired again. The second shot ensured the job was done. In a matter of seconds, the Prius reversed out of the driveway. It sped away, disappearing into the maze of Tallahassee's residential streets. Behind them, in the shaded gloom of the garage, the engine of the Honda Odyssey was still idling. The radio might have still been playing. And Dan Markel was slumped over the steering wheel, the life of a brilliant scholar leaking out onto the upholstery. A few minutes later, a neighbor heard what sounded like a loud bang, a sharp, discordant noise that didn't fit the neighborhood's soundtrack. He walked outside, curious, but not yet alarmed. He looked toward Dan's house. He saw the garage door was open. He saw the car. He saw Dan. The 911 call was a frantic exercise in disbelief. The neighbor told the dispatcher that he found his friend, that there was blood, that he wasn't breathing right. First responders arrived with a sense of urgency that usually skipped Trescott Drive. They found a man who was technically still alive, his body fighting a battle it had already lost. They rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was catastrophic. The legal scholar who had spent his life debating the nuances of justice was now a victim of its most primitive violation. While the police were cordoning off the crime scene, Wendy Adelson was living a life that seemed strangely disconnected. She spent the morning at her home, later claiming she had a Geek Squad appointment to repair a television, a detail that investigators would later find incredibly suspicious. Charlie Adelson had allegedly told a girlfriend that a TV repair was his secret code for a hit. It was a $3,000 repair for a television that cost much less, a numeric anomaly that pointed toward a payoff. Around noon, Wendy got into her car. She drove toward a liquor store to buy a bottle of bourbon for a party. Her route took her past the end of Trescott Drive. She saw the yellow tape. She saw the police cars. She saw the flashing lights. Later, she would tell investigators she thought it was a downed power line or a routine accident. She didn't stop. She didn't call Dan to see if he was okay. She simply turned around and went to lunch with her friends. They sat at a restaurant, eating and chatting, while Dan Markel lay dying in a trauma unit. It was during this lunch that she received the call. Her husband had been shot. Her reaction, witnessed by her friends, was described as a collapse into shock. But the police would soon begin to wonder if the shock was for the tragedy or for the fact that the problem had finally been solved. By the evening of July 18th, the news had sent shockwaves through the global legal community. Dan Markel was dead at 41. The university was in mourning. The Tallahassee Police Department was under immense pressure. They had a dead professor, no weapon, and a green Prius that seemed to have vanished into thin air. But as they began to look into Dan's life, Every road led away from the quiet streets of the capital and straight down the Florida Turnpike, toward a family in South Florida that had been waiting for this day for a very long time. The investigation was only beginning, but the air of Tallahassee remained thick with the scent of a calculated betrayal. The blue walls of the interview room at the Tallahassee Police Department felt cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat outside, where Dan Markel's life had just been violently extinguished. Wendy Adelson sat in that room for 5 hours, still wearing the clothes she had chosen for her lunch date. She was composed, yet fragile, a performance that investigators would later dissect with surgical precision. During that marathon session, she did something that seasoned detectives found deeply unsettling. She offered up a suspect before the police had even finished processing the crime scene. She told the detectives that her brother, Charlie, had joked about hiring a hitman as a graduation gift or a solution to her divorce, adding that it was his twisted way of saying he had her back. It was a joke that felt like a confession wrapped in a dismissal, a way to plant a seed of suspicion that she could later claim was just sibling banter. She spoke about the TV repair. She explained that a technician was supposed to come to her house that morning to fix a screen, a mundane detail that she clung to with strange intensity. To the officers, it seemed like an overconstructed alibi. People experiencing genuine, bone-shattering grief rarely worry about the scheduling of a Geek Squad appointment. She mentioned that Dan was a difficult man, that he was brilliant but rigid, and that their divorce was a nightmare of legal motions and vitriol. She wept, she sipped water, and she played the role of the blindsided widow, but she never once asked about the status of the investigation or if they had any leads on the shooters. Her focus was inward, on the unfairness of the situation and the burden it placed on her. While Wendy was in the interrogation room, the Adelson machinery in South Florida was already in high gear. There was no public statement of grief from Donna or Harvey. There was no offer of a reward for information leading to the capture of the killers. Instead, there was a wall of high-priced legal talent and a sudden, urgent silence. Within 48 hours of the shooting, the exile in Tallahassee was over. Wendy didn't stay to help the police. She didn't stay for the memorial services held by the university. She packed what was left of her life into a van and drove 7 hours south to the gated sanctuary of Coral Springs. The relocation that Dan Markel had fought so hard to prevent in court had been achieved through a caliber of violence the law couldn't anticipate. The move was more than just a change of address. It was an erasure. In the months that followed, the Adelsons reclaimed the boys with a chilling efficiency. The children, who had just lost their father, were quickly integrated into the Adelson lifestyle of country clubs and private schools. In a move that signaled the family's total victory, Wendy legally changed the boy's last name from Markel to Adelson. It was a symbolic stripping of Dan's legacy, a way to ensure that his name would not be carried forward by the sons he had died trying to protect. For Dan's parents, Ruth and Phil Markel, the tragedy was doubled. They had lost their son, and now they were being methodically cut out of their grandsons' lives. Donna Adelson was now the sole arbiter of the boys' future, and she had no intention of sharing them with the family of the man she had called vile. Behind the scenes, the Tallahassee Police Department was struggling. They had the motive. The Adelson solution was the talk of the town, but they lacked the physical bridge. They had surveillance footage of a metallic green Toyota Prius, a vehicle that looked like a ghost on the grainy tapes. They tracked the car through sun-scorched toll booths and traffic cameras, following its path from the North Florida capital all the way back to the outskirts of Miami. But a car isn't a person. They needed a name. They began looking into the TV repair check, a $3,000 payment for a television that cost a fraction of that amount. The numbers didn't make sense, unless the money wasn't for a repair, but for a down payment on a life. Suspicion began to harden around Charlie Adelson. The periodontist with the Ferrari and the high-stakes lifestyle was the obvious link to the world of hired muscle. Investigators started looking at his phone records, mapping out a web of connections that led to a woman named Catherine Magbanua. She was the mother of Sigfredo Garcia's children and, at the time, Charlie's girlfriend. She was the bridge between the sterile world of the Adelson Institute and the grittier reality of the hitmen. Yet even as the pieces began to align, the Adelsons remained untouchable. They lived their lives in the open, attending galas and building their dental empire, as if the blood on Trescott Drive was a distant memory. The case began to take on the weight of a cold investigation. The Tallahassee community was frustrated. The academic world was outraged. It seemed that money and status had bought the Adelsons a shield that the truth couldn't pierce. But the detectives weren't letting go. They were waiting for a crack in the family's armor, waiting for the hubris that often follows a successful crime. They knew that Donna Adelson was the puppet master, and they knew that Charlie was the enforcer. They just needed a way to make them talk. The aftermath of Dan Markel's death wasn't just a period of mourning. It was a long, silent stalemate between a family that thought they had won and a group of investigators who were determined to prove them wrong. The problem had been solved for the Adelsons, but the ghost of Dan Markel was about to become their most persistent witness. The metallic green Toyota Prius was a tactical mistake that the perpetrators likely thought was a stroke of genius. In their minds, a hybrid hatchback was the ultimate urban camouflage, a vehicle so synonymous with suburban errands that it would be invisible to the eyes of Tallahassee's finest. But to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the local detectives, the car was a digital breadcrumb. They began by scouring thousands of hours of highway footage and SunPass toll records, tracking that specific shade of green as it moved across the state. They found that the car had been rented in Miami by a man named Luis Rivera, a high-ranking member of the Latin King street gang. He hadn't traveled alone. With him was Sigfredo Garcia, a man with a violent criminal history and a deep personal connection to a woman named Catherine Magbanua. Catherine, or Katie as she was known, was the linchpin. She wasn't a gang member or a career criminal. She was a mother of two and a professional who moved between two very different worlds. She worked as an assistant at the Adelson Institute, the very dental practice owned by Harvey and Donna Adelson. More importantly, she had been in a long-term relationship with Sigfredo Garcia, the father of her children. But by the summer of 2014, she was also the girlfriend of Charlie Adelson. The 6 degrees of separation had collapsed into a single, damning link. Investigators began to dig into Katie's finances, discovering a trail of ghost payments. She was receiving regular checks from the Adelson family business, checks signed by Donna Adelson for work she seemingly never performed. It was a payroll for silence, a financial tether designed to keep the middlewoman close. By 2016, the authorities had enough to arrest the hitmen. Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera were taken into custody, but the masterminds in South Florida remained untouched. The Adelsons retreated further into their shell, hiring the best criminal defense attorneys Miami had to offer. They didn't speak. They didn't crack. To bridge the gap between the trigger pullers and the dentists, the FBI decided to rattle the cage with a sophisticated sting operation known as the Bump. In April 2016, an undercover FBI agent posing as a representative of the hitmen approached Donna Adelson on a busy street in Miami. He called himself Joe. He didn't threaten her with violence. He threatened her with exposure. He handed her a newspaper clipping about Dan Markel's murder with a phone number written on it, telling her that his friend, Garcia, was in trouble and needed $5,000 to help his family. He was a blackmailer from a world Donna didn't understand. A normal person, innocent of any crime, would have immediately walked into the nearest police station to report an extortion attempt. Donna Adelson did the opposite. She retreated to her home and immediately picked up the phone. She didn't call the authorities. She called Charlie. The FBI had already secured wiretaps on their lines, and for the first time, the investigators heard the family's clinical facade begin to crumble. Donna was frantic. She spoke in a panicked, coded shorthand, telling Charlie that the man had approached her and knew everything. She described the encounter with a vibrating terror, asking her son how this could be happening. Charlie, ever the strategist, tried to calm her, but his own voice betrayed a frantic edge. They spoke about the paper and the need to take care of things, never once using the word murder, but the subtext was screaming through the receivers. The investigation reached its cinematic peak at a Miami restaurant called Dolce Vita. Charlie Adelson met Katie Magbanua there, to discuss the blackmailer and the bump. The FBI had bugged the table, but the restaurant was a cacophony of clinking silverware and background chatter. Technicians spent months cleaning up the audio, but the visual evidence was already enough. Charlie was seen leaning in close to Katie, his body language suggesting a man who was fighting for his life. He discussed the possibility that the blackmailer was a cop, but he also debated whether they should just pay the money to make the problem go away. He was caught in a paradox of his own making. If he didn't pay, he risked exposure. If he did pay, he was admitting guilt. Despite the damning nature of the wiretaps and the Dolce Vita recording, the state attorney's office was hesitant. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but they lacked a direct confession. They knew the Adelsons were the architects, but they needed to flip Katie Magbanua. For years, the case stalled. Katie went to trial and refused to talk, even as she faced life in prison. She remained loyal to the family that was paying her way. But the detectives weren't retreating. They were waiting for the generational arrogance of the Adelsons to provide the final opening. They had watched a brilliant man be executed in his garage, and they were willing to wait a decade if it meant the person who signed the checks finally faced the same bars as the person who pulled the trigger. The bump hadn't led to an immediate arrest, but it had poisoned the Adelsons' peace, turning their luxury condos into gilded cages where every ringing phone was a potential threat. The dominoes didn't fall at once. They tipped slowly over a decade of painstaking litigation. The breakthrough came in 2022 when Catherine Magbanua was finally convicted of first-degree murder. Faced with the prospect of dying in a cell, she finally broke her silence. Her testimony provided the direct link needed to haul Charlie Adelson into a Tallahassee courtroom in November 2023. Charlie tried to sell a desperate story, claiming he was the victim of an extortion plot by the hitmen. The jury took less than 3 hours to find him guilty on all counts. The conviction shattered the family's remaining hubris. Within days, Donna Adelson was caught on a wiretap discussing an exit strategy. On November 13th, 2023, she and Harvey arrived at Miami International Airport with one-way tickets to Vietnam. They never made it past the boarding gate. Donna was handcuffed at the terminal. The matriarch, who had once controlled every aspect of her children's lives, was led away in tears, finally forced to face the law she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. The Adelsons thought their wealth and prestige made them untouchable, but the law Dan Markel spent his life teaching finally caught up to them. Donna Adelson, once the queen of a dental empire, now resides in the very system she tried to circumvent. The boys, now bearing the name Adelson, will one day learn the bitter truth about the man who died to keep them in his life. Justice moved slowly, but in the end, the professor won his final case. The contract was closed, but the cost was an entire family's soul. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.